Say it clear.
You are the master that pleases me to serve you. You are the master that pleases me to serve you.
Stop.
You are the master that pleases me to serve you.
You sit your down like I said. You sorry?
Yes.
You sorry about what?
Everything.
Jumping in the car with a motherfucker you don't know?
Yes.
You sorry?
Yes.
You want to say something to your kids?
Mama, sorry.
Who raising your kids?
Me and my mom and dad.
You ain't raising shit. You on here in your back smoking crack. Number one. First was 19 years old. Name,
They found the first tape in a locked metal cabinet, a VHS cassette labeled Your Wedding Day. When investigators pressed play, the room filled with the sound of a woman begging for her life. A wooden support beam, a leather belt tightening around her neck, a male voice apathetically saying, "First kill, 19 years old." Detectives watched in silence. Some turned away, one walked out. The chief of police mandated all officers who watched the footage to attend counseling services. What they didn't know yet was that the man behind the camera had killed before and would kill again. They didn't know that he chose women the world ignored, that he disposed of them along highways like discarded trash bags, or that he believed none of them mattered enough for anyone to notice. But they noticed. And when he finally made his one mistake, one map printed from one website at one deadly moment, the facade he'd built began to crumble, and the monster behind it stepped into the light. This is the investigation he tried to erase. This is the truth he tried to take to the grave. On paper, Maury Travis's childhood looks almost offensively ordinary. He was born October 25th, 1965, in St. Louis, Missouri, to Michael and Sandra Travis. No burned-out tenement, no headline-grabbing abuse case, just a black family trying to move upward in a city already starting to fracture along class and racial lines. His earliest memories formed in Carr Square Village, a public housing complex north of downtown. Brick buildings stood close together, children played in the courtyards, and the sound of sirens was just part of the neighborhood soundtrack. To the people who lived there, it was home. To a boy like Maury, it was also a lesson. You survived by keeping your head down and your business to yourself. When he was about 10, his parents moved him out of the city's core and into the suburbs, buying a small ranch house on Ford Drive in Ferguson. It was the type of place that could disappear into any Midwestern subdivision. Low roofline, trimmed lawn, a single tree out front. Neighbors later struggled to remember the family at all. They recalled a quiet boy who would sometimes mow a lawn, maybe ride his bike down the street, but nothing that stuck. Even as a child, Travis learned how to occupy space without drawing attention. Sometime in the late 1970s, his parents split up. His father faded into the background. Maury stayed in the house with his mother, Sandra. She worked long hours, kept the place orderly, and pushed him through school. Teachers remembered her as involved, strict but polite when she came in for conferences. If there was turmoil inside the home, it never spilled into the records. He attended local schools in North St. Louis County, McClure North, and later another area high school, keeping to himself in hallways filled with louder boys who wanted attention. He was not the class clown or the budding athlete. He was the kid you forgot about as soon as he walked past. Travis himself, in the last days of his life, insisted that something inside him had already gone wrong by then. In the suicide note he wrote to his mother from jail, he confessed nothing about the murders, but he did describe his mind. "I've been sick for a long time. Sick in the head, since I was about 14. I don't know why. I was just sick. I've never felt normal or happy at any time in my life." It is one of the only glimpses we get of how he framed his adolescence. A private narrative of inner sickness that no one around him could see or verify. Detectives who dug through his past after his arrest found no documented history of childhood abuse. No hospitalizations for mental illness. No juvenile record of violent outbursts. Friends from those years didn't come forward with stories of animal torture or sadistic games. Instead, they described someone shy, awkward, occasionally sullen, but nothing more. After high school, Travis drifted into adulthood the same way he had moved through adolescence, quietly, almost imperceptibly. He left Missouri to attend Morris Brown College for a time, then returned home and slipped into a series of jobs that allowed him to stay on the periphery of people's attention. Those who crossed paths with him in these years described him the same way his teachers once had: polite, distant, and hard to read. In the end, that may have been his greatest advantage. Before he ever lured a woman into his basement, Maury Travis had already mastered the most important skill a serial predator can have in a community: the ability to look like no one at all. When he returned to Missouri in the late 1980s, something had already shifted beneath the surface. He had developed a cocaine addiction, the kind that doesn't take over in a single night but seeps into a person slowly, tightening around whatever loneliness or instability they already carry. By 1987, that addiction was eating through his savings and pushing him into darker territory. His addiction worsened. By 1988, he was burning through more money than he could earn. Rather than letting the facade crack, Travis found a different route: a string of robberies, almost always at shoe stores, usually with a toy gun or simulated weapon. Reports from the time paint him not as a reckless armed criminal, but as a strange, almost timid robber, quiet, controlled, not inclined to violence. He was caught in January 1989 after multiple holdups and pleaded guilty to federal and state charges. A sitting congressman even wrote a letter on his behalf, asking the court for leniency based on Travis's prior volunteer work and apparent potential. It didn't work. He was sentenced to 15 years in the Missouri Department of Corrections. By 1994, after serving roughly 5 years, he was paroled. He walked out of prison without a single write-up for violence, without any incident suggesting the brutality he would one day unleash. To the parole board, he looked like a model inmate. Back in Ferguson, he slipped easily back into anonymity. He worked as a waiter at a well-known St. Louis restaurant near Lafayette Square. Co-workers remembered him as reserved, intense at times, but professional and polite. Regular customers tipped him well. He knew how to move around people without disturbing them, but the cracks were still there. In 1998, he was arrested for cocaine possession and received probation. In 1999, he was picked up for a DWI. Each of these incidents shows a man whose inner world was unraveling again, even as he maintained a convincing outward calm. What developed during these years was something far more dangerous: the confidence that he could hide anything. He had hidden his addiction. He had hidden his robberies behind a mask of normalcy. He had hidden his years in prison. He had hidden the dark impulses that would soon find their outlet. By the time he entered the year 2000, Maury Travis was outwardly stable, employed, quiet, self-contained. But beneath that calm surface, the part of him he called sick since I was 14 had finally begun to take shape, and he was preparing to feed it. Somewhere between 1999 and 2001, long before detectives knew his name, Travis abducted a woman in St. Louis. The victim later told police he picked her up, took her to a location she couldn't identify, tied her, beat her, repeatedly sexually assaulted her, and held her captive for hours. She escaped, barefoot, terrified, and called 911 from a payphone. Her mother confirmed her injuries. She identified Maury Travis as the attacker. But the police report written afterward appeared to dismiss the allegations. The detective noted the woman was a drug user. He questioned her credibility. He asked her to return to the station and sign paperwork if she wanted to press charges. She never came back, terrified he would find her again. And the case was quietly shelved. Years later, after Travis's arrest, that same victim said she recognized him on the news immediately. She had survived a man the police didn't believe existed. A second woman survived Travis as well, though she would never be able to speak coherently about what happened. She was found severely beaten and brain damaged after fleeing an unknown assailant. When investigators finally reviewed Travis's videotapes, they believed she was one of the women on the recordings, tied, tortured, begging. She had escaped his basement, but the damage he inflicted meant she would never testify. He began killing the same way he lived his life, quietly, without fanfare, without leaving anything behind that spoke above a whisper. But the pattern was unmistakable once investigators finally stepped back far enough to see it. One by one, black women working the margins of St. Louis disappeared, women addicted, impoverished, alone, and targeted precisely because they occupied a place he believed no one cared to look. Between July 2000 and May 2002, Maury Travis hunted them with methodical patience, moving across city lines, state lines, and jurisdictions, dumping bodies in places where nature and time could erase what he had done. He left no obvious signatures at first, only the quiet consistency of strangulation, body disposal, and rural isolation. It was not until the killings escalated, and until he wanted recognition, that the facade cracked. Mary Shields, July 31, 2000, East St. Louis, Illinois. Mary Shields was 61 years old, older than most of his later victims, and known to walk the East St. Louis tracks near 15th Street. When her body was found on July 31, 2000, wrapped in a green trash bag, it was already badly decomposed. The medical examiner determined she had been strangled. At the time, investigators weren't thinking this was the work of a serial killer. It looked like another tragic death in a city plagued by violence. No one connected it to a serial predator. But the manner of disposal, the bag, the roadside placement, the attempt to reduce trace evidence would become familiar. Alicia Greenwade, April 1, 2001, Washington Park, Illinois. 34-year-old Alicia Greenwade vanished from the St. Louis sex trade circuit sometime in late March 2001. On April 1st, her body appeared near Interstate 64, close to Washington Park. She was partially wrapped in plastic, left near an isolated roadway. The scene gave investigators their first real physical clue: a Bridgestone Potenza tire print in the soft earth near her body. This tread pattern would later match one of the two vehicles Travis drove. Her cause of death: strangulation. Her connection to Travis, later confirmed by tire evidence and the discovery of her presence on his videotapes. She would become one of the two victims named in the federal kidnapping indictment filed against him. Cassandra Walker, March 24, 2001. Near Washington Park, I-64 corridor. Just 19, Cassandra Walker was barely an adult. She disappeared from St. Louis in March 2001, and her body was found on March 24th, dumped near a roadside close to where Greenwade would later be found. In Travis's basement tapes, the ones police would later call pure evil, a young woman appears chained to a support post. Travis stands behind her, tightening a belt around her neck. Her hands are bound. She struggles, gasps, collapses. He says on camera, "This is first kill, number one." First kill was 19 years old. Investigators and Cassandra's family believe those words were about her. Her family had described her as having got off on the wrong track for a minute, but she was loved, she was cared for, and she had people waiting for her to come home. She never did. Teresa Wilson, May 15, 2001. West Alton, Missouri. Teresa Wilson's body was discovered along Highway 67, near an on-ramp in West Alton, on May 15, 2001. She was nude, her body exposed to the elements, and she had been dead for approximately 5 days. Nothing at the scene gave investigators a name. No one had reported her missing. A year later, the Post-Dispatch ran a profile on her struggles, her addiction, her attempts to survive the St. Louis streets. That article would provoke the killer himself to write a letter demanding more stories, mocking her death, and directing police to another body. Teresa Wilson became the catalyst that forced Maury Travis into the light. Betty James, May 23, 2001, St. Louis, Missouri. Betty James, 46, was found along a St. Louis roadside in late May 2001. Betty appears alive in one of Travis's videotapes. She is restrained, terrified, pleading. Her presence on that tape, combined with the tire evidence and blood found in the basement, made her one of the two victims in the federal kidnapping indictment. Her family believed she had accepted a ride from someone who looked like he had money. Travis cultivated this exact illusion. Verona Ronnie Thompson, June 29, 2001. West Alton, Missouri. On June 29, 2001, the body of Verona Thompson, 36, was discovered less than 20 feet from where Teresa Wilson had been found. Same highway, same dumping pattern, same cause of death, strangulation. Yvonne Cruz, August 25, 2001, East St. Louis, Illinois. Yvonne Cruz was found near the I-64 corridor in August 2001. Police recovered DNA from her body belonging to an unknown male, later matched to Travis through the soda can he drank during questioning. Cruz's murder finally pushed East St. Louis police to consider the possibility of a serial predator targeting black women across jurisdictions. Still, without a suspect or consistent crime scene signatures, they were hunting a ghost. Brenda Beasley, October 8, 2001. East St. Louis, Illinois. 33-year-old Brenda Beasley was discovered near Converse Avenue on October 8, 2001. Her body showed evidence of either blunt force trauma or strangulation. Accounts differ based on decomposition stage, but the most damning link came later. DNA on a spoon in Travis's kitchen matched her. Blood in the basement matched her. And a woman matching her appearance is shown on his tapes. Alive, crying, chained, begging. Her death solidified the case's trajectory. The same man was killing across both states. Between January and May of 2002, 4 additional Jane Does were found. January 30, 2002, near Mascoutah, Illinois. March 11, 2002, near Highland, Illinois. March 28, 2002, near Columbia, Illinois. May 25, 2002, near West Alton, Missouri, all black women. They were all believed to be prostitutes. Travis had hidden himself behind the anonymity of women the world ignored. He had succeeded, until an article about one of his victims provoked him into stepping forward. On May 19, 2002, St. Louis Post-Dispatch reporter Bill Smith published a long, compassionate profile on Teresa Wilson. The piece refused to treat her as another roadside casualty. Instead, it rebuilt her story from the fragments addiction and poverty had left behind. The narrative gave Teresa dignity, and to a man like Travis, it was an unforgivable offense. It pulled her out of the shadows he operated within. 4 days later, an envelope appeared on Smith's desk. The return address read, Thraldom, 325-331 Lafayette Street, New York, NY 1012. The name 222 belonged to a bondage website. The address was fake. The postmark, however, came from St. Louis. Inside, Smith found a single sheet of paper printed in red ink using a decorative script font. The message was chilling in its sarcasm and contempt. Dear Bill, nice sob story about Teresa Wilson, it began. The writer demanded a similar article about another victim, Alicia Greenwade. He then offered directions to number 17, adding that if Smith printed another story in the Sunday edition, he would reveal many others. Attached to the letter was a trimmed computer printout of a map. Someone had cut off the website heading. A small X marked a spot near the intersection of Highway 67 and the St. Charles Street on-ramp in West Alton, just miles from where Teresa Wilson's body had been found. Smith gave the letter to police immediately, and officers arranged a search of the area the killer had marked. Within the 50-yard radius he specified, they found a skull, scattered bones, and the decomposed remains of a woman who still has not been identified. The killer's message was real. His taunt was deliberate. The only clue he left behind was the map. At first glance, it seemed hopeless. There were no fingerprints on the letter or envelope, no saliva on the stamp, no DNA on the paper. The map itself had been trimmed so precisely that even the website identifying information was gone. But one cybercrimes investigator with the Illinois State Police believed the map could still be traced. He spent hours comparing it against every commercial mapping product he knew: MapQuest, Rand McNally, DeLorme, even CD-ROM map programs sold in the late 1990s. Finally, he found an exact match. The map came from Expedia.com, which at the time used Microsoft's mapping software. Because the layout, pixel structure, and rendering were proprietary, investigators realized something extraordinary. Only one website in the world produced that specific format. That meant the map could potentially be traced to the user who generated it. Federal agents subpoenaed Expedia's server logs. In response, the company provided a list of all the IP addresses that had accessed that exact West Alton location between May 19th, the day Teresa's profile ran, and May 21st, the date stamped on the envelope. There was only one. One search, one user, one digital fingerprint. The IP address, 65.227.106.78, belonged to UUNet, an internet service provider. When agents subpoenaed UUNet for subscriber information, they were directed to a modest ranch home in the 1000 block of Ford Drive in Ferguson, Missouri. The account associated with that address belonged to MSN Maury Travis. Detectives began 24-hour surveillance on the house. It belonged to Travis's mother, Sandra, but investigators quickly concluded that Maury himself was the primary resident. They observed his vehicle, his movements, and the fact that the house's basement windows were always dark. They waited until the warrant was ready. On June 7, 2002, St. Louis Metropolitan Police Detective Sergeant Tim Sachs approached the front door with FBI agents and officers from multiple jurisdictions behind him. When Travis opened the door, shirtless, irritated, and half awake, he snapped, "It's 7 o'clock in the morning," Sachs replied evenly. "You're right, and we're serving a federal search warrant." Travis asked why they were there. Sachs answered, "You know why we're here." Travis lowered his head and nodded. When the door opened on Ford Drive that morning, Maury Travis stood before the investigators half-dressed, irritably tugging on clothing as if they were an inconvenience. Minutes earlier, he had been asleep. Now he was being pulled into the center of a nightmare he had spent years constructing, and believed he had expertly concealed. They gathered in the living room, a quiet, unremarkable space Travis had fashioned into a kind of conversation pit. Sofas arranged around a small coffee table, a neutral-colored carpet, ordinary lamps, a room that, on its surface, radiated harmlessness. Investigators would later say it was a very normal living room in a very normal house, but the basement beneath it was anything but normal. The basement was a house of torture. There were bloodstains on the carpet, the walls, and even the ceiling. Women's shoes, underwear, wigs, and personal items littered the room. A stun gun lay on a shelf. A locked file cabinet contained belts, rope, tape, gloves, and other restraints. Behind another panel, investigators found videotapes of women being tortured, beat, sexually assaulted, and killed, enough to later require mandatory counseling for every detective who viewed them. Inside the basement sat the computer that had accessed the map. Forensic examiners later recovered deleted drafts of the letter Travis had mailed to Bill Smith. As officers in the basement cataloged evidence, Travis, Detective Sergeant Tim Sachs of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, an FBI profiler, an expert in the psychology and interrogation of serial killers, and two additional investigators, Roy Douglas and Illinois State Police Special Agent James Walker, sat in the family room. As they settled in, Travis's calico cat stretched lazily and wandered into the room. It brushed against chairs, moved from investigator to investigator, even attempted to climb onto a lap or two. Each time someone reached out to stroke its fur, Travis tensed. His body stiffened. He leaned forward in his seat. He didn't appreciate it at all, Sachs later said. For a man who had spent years exerting absolute dominance over his victims, watching someone else touch something he considered his seemed intolerable. At one point, he abruptly lifted the cat, placed it beside him, and kept it shielded from the investigators. Out of reach, as though he were reclaiming control of the only innocent thing in the house. For the next 2 hours, the investigators attempted to ease into conversation. They tried small talk. They tried casual questions. They tried indirect angles into his past. But each attempt slid off him like water on glass. They asked him where he grew up. He answered with another question. Where did you grow up? They asked him what he did as a child. Nothing, he answered flatly. Went to school, what did you do? Sachs would later say Travis redirected everything, every question, every attempt at insight, every push toward his past. It wasn't verbal sparring. It was exertion of power. He wanted to be in control, Sachs said. Not once did he ask why they were there. Not once did he ask what they were looking for. Not once did he ask what had led investigators to his door. He showed no fear. He showed no curiosity. He showed no guilt. He sat like a man playing a game that only he knew the rules to. Hours later, at police headquarters, Travis was moved into a small interrogation room. Sachs sat across from him again, this time separated from the distractions of home, the cat, the familiar scenery. Now it was just the two of them, and the profiler had given Sachs one directive: find the crack in Maury Travis's shell. The interview stretched nearly 3 hours, then 5, then 8. Sachs kept trying to pull Travis toward the truth of who he was and what he had done, but Travis responded like a man picking apart each question for weakness. He deflected, he inverted, he redirected. Sachs asked about girlfriends. Travis said yes, he had dated. Sachs asked about prostitutes. Again, yes, he had paid for them. Sachs asked whether he had been abused as a child. No, Travis said. Then he threw the question back with unsettling speed. How about you? At one point, Sachs tried a psychological approach used in profiling, asking Travis whether violent behavior was something a person was born with or learned. Travis leaned back, eyes flat, voice stripped of emotion. He said I would never understand, Sachs recalled. He said he was born like this. He said he'd been like this as long as he could remember. No trauma, no trigger, no turning point, just darkness, starting in childhood, lingering, growing. Throughout the questioning, Sachs noticed something else. Travis showed genuine affection for only one person, his mother. When she came up, his tone shifted almost imperceptibly. He seemed fond of her, protective, a son rather than a predator. But even that human flicker never grew into remorse. Investigators watched closely. Every twitch, every change in breathing, every subtle cue that might signal regret. They saw nothing, absolutely none, Sachs would later say. No guilt, no remorse. As the evidence mounted, tape after tape, blood sample after blood sample, Travis began tapping his fingers on the table. It was the only visible sign that the gravity of the moment was registering. Still, he refused to budge. When investigators finally told him, "You know what we found in your basement," Travis didn't flinch. "Yeah," he replied. "I knew you'd find it." There was no shock, no confusion, no denial, just a quiet acknowledgement that the facade had collapsed. A few times, the enormity of the situation seemed to catch up to him, and he dropped his head. "I'm toast," he muttered once. After nearly 8 hours, Sachs stepped out, allowing investigators Douglas and Walker to take over. Their interrogation style was sharper, more direct, more confrontational. They had produced results in the past with other suspects. Their approach worked quickly, perhaps too quickly. Only 19 minutes into their session, Travis's demeanor changed. His walls went back up. His tone hardened. He stopped answering questions and leaned forward with a final declaration. "I'm not going back to prison." Then, with a chilling calmness, he requested an attorney. The interview ended. So did their chance at a confession. After the interrogation, after the DNA match, after investigators uncovered the tapes, the ropes, the blood, and the outlines of a dungeon he hadn't yet completed, Maury Travis was transferred to the St. Louis County Justice Center in Clayton. Federal authorities held him there under contract as they prepared the charges, 2 federal counts of kidnapping resulting in death, with additional homicide charges pending from multiple jurisdictions on both sides of the river. They placed him on 24-hour suicide watch. They believed he was dangerous, but not to himself. Dangerous in the sense that he held answers no one else had. Answers that families needed. Answers that the FBI wanted preserved for training future agents. Answers that investigators hoped would lead them to the women who had never been found. But Travis had no intention of giving anything to anyone. Inside the jail, his cell was simple. A metal toilet and sink unit, a bed bolted to the floor, concrete walls, and an air vent positioned high above the toilet. A small observation window allowed officers to check on him every 15 minutes, as required for suicide watch inmates. In that setting, sterile, controlled, monitored, no one expected him to find an escape. But escape was the one thing he had always been good at. In the evening hours of June 10, 2002, only 3 days after his arrest, the system around him faltered. Officers assigned to monitor him missed not one, but two scheduled checks. Whether it was complacency, exhaustion, distraction, or negligence, no one noticed that for nearly 45 minutes, Travis was left alone and unseen. It was enough time. Later, investigative reconstructions revealed what happened next. Travis tore a long strip from his bedsheet, twisting it into a rope with cold, methodical quiet. He threaded the fabric through the ventilation grate above the toilet. The vent was narrow, but it offered a solid anchoring point. He pulled the sheet down into a loop, tightening it into a noose. Then, in a final act of absolute, deliberate control, he bound his own hands behind his back. Investigators would later say he did this to prevent the reflex to save himself, a recognition of how strong the instinct to survive can be, even in a man who believed himself beyond redemption. When officers eventually returned to the observation window, they saw his body hanging beside the bed, suspended from the vent, his feet slightly off the floor. A pillowcase had been pulled over his head. He had already grown cold. On the bed was a handwritten letter addressed to his mother. It read like the final monologue of a man determined to write his own ending. "Dear Mom, I'm sorry for the pain this has caused you and the family. My death seems to be the only way out and a fast end to all the publicity. You were the best mother a man can have. But I've been sick for a long time, sick in the head, since I was about 14. I don't know why. I was just sick. I've never felt normal or happy at any time in my life. Think about the life I lead and what's ahead of me. This seems the best solution for all involved, especially me, because I won't spend the rest of my life locked up or worse. Let them kill me with a needle. Tell Grandma, Marina, James, and everybody I loved them dearly. I love you the most, but you know that. Forever your son, Toby Travis." He confessed nothing in the note. Not the murders, not the torture, not the number of women he claimed in his letter to the newspaper. He offered closure to no one except himself. The letter was not remorseful. It was self-explanatory, self-protective, and ultimately self-serving, just like the man who wrote it. For investigators, his death was a catastrophe. Detective Sergeant Sachs said later, he had 1,000,000 questions. 1,000,001 questions, and he took every answer with him. His suicide ended the possibility of recovering the 5 additional victims he claimed, clarifying the identities of the women seen on the tapes, identifying the Jane Does found in 2002, learning whether he killed elsewhere before the year 2000, understanding the psychology of a predator who had left almost no trace of himself in childhood or adolescence. Travis died exactly as he lived, on his own terms, withholding everything, leaving behind only horror, unanswered questions, and the disturbing reality that the full story of his crimes is buried forever inside the mind of a man who refused to give investigators even a final word. The Ford Drive house has long since been rented to new tenants. Children ride bicycles past the quiet ranch. Neighbors mow their lawns without knowing, or without wanting to know, what happened beneath the floorboards. The basement has been renovated. The blood is gone. The walls have been painted. But the history is permanent. The women he killed lived on the margins, but their stories did not end in obscurity. Each remains a name in a file, a victim in a case, a mother, a daughter, a sister whose life was stolen by a man who believed no one would ever fight for them. In death, they gained the voice he tried so hard to silence. And Maury Travis, who built a basement for torture and planned to build cells for captivity, who mocked his victims and taunted the press, who thought he was smarter than the world around him, left this life the same way he lived it, quietly, secretly, and with a final act of control. That basement remains the only place where the truth of what he did was ever fully known, and it died with him.
More news tonight. Terry Blair is now a convicted serial killer.
I find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Terry Blair, is guilty of murder in the first degree for the murders of Sheila McKenzie, Patricia Wilson, Anna Ewing, Darcy Williams, Claudette Junil, and Carmen Hunt.
Before anyone said his name, before detectives connected the bodies, before Kansas City understood what was moving in the shadows along Prospect Avenue, women were disappearing in ways that should have set off alarms. They were seen stepping into cars they shouldn't have trusted. They were seen walking under broken streetlights toward the same alleys. They were seen alive by people who assumed they would return because danger on Prospect was routine. Not remarkable. But then they didn't come back. Then their bodies began to surface. One woman found in an alley behind a collapsing house. Another lying in a garage used more for storage than protection. Another inside a vacant apartment so degraded it barely qualified as shelter. Some decomposed, some half-clothed. What connected them was not just proximity or circumstance. It was the hands around their throats. The same bruising, the same crushed cartilage, the same final seconds spent gasping for air while no one heard them struggle. The police didn't know it yet, but they were looking at the work of a man whose violence did not erupt suddenly. It was cultivated. It was shaped over decades. It was forged in a childhood surrounded by brutality so constant, it became normal. He had killed before. The system had let him go. When he came back to Prospect Avenue, he blended into the decaying landscape like he had never left it. On these streets, women live with danger every night. They protect each other when they can, warn each other when they're able, and hope the next client won't be the one that ends their life. But the man moving through Prospect in 2003 and 2004 didn't look like a monster. He didn't chase, didn't shout, didn't draw attention. He walked calmly, quietly, with a blankness that made him forgettable until he had his hands around your neck. This is the story of those women, their lives, their deaths, and the man who hunted them in plain sight. Terry Blair did not descend into violence. He emerged from it, and once he was free again, nothing stood between him and the women who became the final link in a chain of generational brutality that Kansas City had never fully understood, until their bodies forced it to. Terry Blair was born in 1961 into a Kansas City household that reporters would later describe as one of the most violent family systems in Missouri's modern criminal history. His childhood was shaped not by isolated incidents of aggression, but by a continuous environment of conflict, instability, and trauma. The Blair home existed in a part of Kansas City where structural neglect had already taken root. Crumbling rental properties, inconsistent utilities, and neighborhoods where police cars appeared more often than school buses. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense, unpredictable, and frequently unsafe. Violence was not an occasional eruption. It was the family's primary method of communication. Arguments escalated rapidly, often resulting in physical fights that the children witnessed from rooms with thin walls and doors that never fully closed. The adults in Terry's life did not shield him from conflict. They enacted it in front of him. He learned early that fear was a constant, that anger had no warning signs, and that pain could erupt from any direction at any time. Terry's mother, Janice Blair, struggled with her own psychological issues, shaped by a history of trauma that predated her children. She was volatile, harsh, and uncontained. She administered discipline in ways that frightened the children, and her emotional instability meant the Blair household never settled into routine. Neighbors later reported hearing screaming late at night, fights breaking out in the yard, and children crying for long stretches without an adult intervening. In interviews, some neighbors described the Blair children as wandering, sometimes outside at late hours, often hungry, sometimes barefoot, and always wary of approaching strangers. The children had the look of kids who knew home was not a safe place to retreat to. Terry's father was a vicious man. His relationship with Janice was one of control and violence. It was common for neighbors to hear the sound of blows landing, furniture overturning, or doors slamming during arguments that could last for hours. Police responded to the Blair residence multiple times, according to archived reports, though intervention rarely produced any meaningful change. In 1978, when Terry was still a teenager, the cycle ended abruptly. During yet another domestic incident, Janice Blair killed Terry's father. The homicide shattered any remaining structure in the household. The children watched police swarm the home, watched their mother taken away, and watched the dismantling of whatever fragile normalcy had existed. The emotional fallout of such an event is severe under any circumstances. For Terry Blair, who had already demonstrated emotional detachment and violent impulses in adolescence, it was a further normalization of deadly force. The idea that an interpersonal conflict could end in homicide was not shocking to him. It was familiar. The Blair family's violent legacy did not end with that homicide. One of Terry's brothers would later be executed for murdering a neighbor. One of his sisters killed a man. Another one of his brothers was convicted of forcible sodomy, assault, and kidnapping, and was sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 240 years. Another brother was sentenced to federal prison for selling dope, a nephew sentenced for forcible sodomy and kidnapping, another nephew sentenced for 88 counts of armed robbery, and a third nephew sentenced for killing his father. Terry grew up absorbing every lesson the environment taught him. People hurt each other. People die in the middle of arguments. Control is maintained through force. Empathy is unnecessary. Fear is normal. These lessons followed him into adolescence, where they hardened. Every indicator that typically signals trouble in a young adolescent appeared in Terry with alarming consistency. He struggled academically from the moment he entered middle school. Teachers recorded that he could not concentrate, that his mind drifted, and that he displayed a persistent disconnect between instruction and comprehension. He performed poorly in every major academic area, often failing to complete assignments and rarely participating in class discussions. It was not laziness. It was the product of a child who had never been given space to develop higher cognitive functioning beyond basic emotional defense mechanisms. His inability to concentrate was frequently paired with explosive emotional reactions. Staff members noted that small frustrations could trigger large outbursts, desk slamming, verbal aggression, or complete refusal to engage. Socially, Terry remained detached. The other students kept their distance from him, not necessarily because of anything he did openly, but because his demeanor carried an undercurrent of unpredictability. He rarely smiled, rarely laughed, and rarely spoke with other kids unless he was forced into interaction. Even then, his responses came out flat, monotone, or charged with irritation. Counselors who interacted with him noted that he lacked the emotional vocabulary to describe his feelings and the interpersonal skills needed to build connections. His ability to trust was absent, shaped by the constant betrayals and volatility he had experienced at home. When teachers attempted to intervene, their efforts only highlighted the distance Terry kept between himself and the rest of the world. He did not consider adults allies. Adults, in his experience, were the source of most danger. As he progressed through his teen years, additional risk factors appeared. He was not a boy who provoked fights for entertainment or out of bravado. He was a boy who reacted to perceived challenges with immediate aggression, because that was the only model he had ever been taught. By his late teenage years, signs of psychopathy, or at least severe antisocial traits, were becoming clear. Terry exhibited emotional flattening, lack of guilt, stunted empathy, impulsive aggression, inability to regulate anger, difficulty maintaining relationships, detachment from consequences, and chronic fear mixed with chronic hostility. By the time he entered his early 20s, Terry Blair was not stepping into adulthood as a stable or functional individual. He was carrying decades of psychological damage, untreated trauma, and behavioral conditioning that would eventually erupt into lethal violence. At 20 years old, Terry entered a relationship with Angela Monroe, a young woman who would later become the mother of several of his children. Their relationship unfolded in the environment Terry knew best: unpredictability, emotional volatility, and domestic violence. She bore the brunt of his anger, endured the escalating aggression, and likely feared the unpredictable shifts in mood that marked their daily life. By May of 1982, Angela was 7 months pregnant. She carried a near-term child during a period when their relationship had deteriorated under mounting pressure. On May 15, 1982, under the dead orange glow of the streetlights at Linwood Boulevard and Forest Avenue, something began to unravel between them. It's alleged that Terry discovered Angela was prostituting, something that Terry deeply despised. The two began to argue, and Terry beat her to death. Angela's body was found on a sidewalk behind a building at 1205 Linwood Boulevard, lying cold on the concrete as if she had been discarded there. When police traced her last known movements, all roads ran backwards toward Terry Blair. But Terry did something unexpected. He called the police himself early that morning, telling them that Angela had been killed. He didn't confess, not directly, but he began with a lie that revealed more than he understood. He said he believed she had been killed by her pimp. Prosecutors would later reveal that the man Terry blamed had a solid alibi for the entire night. At first, Terry denied involvement entirely. Then he contradicted himself. Eventually, police testified. He confessed to killing Angela during an interrogation, a confession he would later attempt to retract, claiming he never said such things. But the damage was done, imprinted in statements, reports, and the physical truth of Angela Monroe's injuries. By May 16th, Terry Blair was arrested and booked into the Jackson County Jail under a $20,000 bond. When the Jackson County jury returned its verdict, they convicted him of second-degree murder, recommending a 25-year sentence for the death of the woman he once claimed to love and the unborn child she was carrying. Prison did nothing to cauterize the violence in him. 2 decades behind razor wire only hardened it, forging Terry Blair into a man whose rage had matured, sharpened, and waited, quietly, until the door finally opened. On May 16, 2002, Blair received conditional release and transitioned to a halfway house. On July 24th, he tested positive for marijuana. He was sent back to prison for violating parole on August 8, 2002. On January 21, 2004, Blair made parole and was sent back to a halfway house. By the summer of 2004, Terry Blair was moving in familiar territory. He split his time between his mother's apartment at 2449 Prospect Avenue and his sister's duplex at 1340 West Bluff. Just upstairs from his mother, a man let local prostitutes come in to eat, sleep, and shower, turning that stretch of Prospect into a revolving door of people living right on the edge. Blair's grandmother lived close by at 2454 Olive, keeping his entire orbit within a few tight blocks of the same streets where bodies would soon be found. Police already knew Prospect as an area of prostitution and extreme vulnerability, but in July and early September, the pattern turned from dangerous to systematic. On July 14, 2004, officers were called to 2608 East 23rd Street, a property in a part of Kansas City already known as a prostitution zone. In the backyard, near a raised concrete pad, they found the body of Anna Ewing. She had been concealed, partially hidden in the brush, her body left outside like refuse behind the house. Ewing was almost completely naked. The only clothing still on her body was a bra, partially in place, and a knitted garment wrapped around her neck. Her legs and feet were muddy, suggesting she'd been moved or had gone down on the ground before she was killed. She had abrasions on her arm, bruising on her shoulder, and visible bleeding above her right eyebrow and in the white of one eye, physical signs of trauma and compression. The lab tested her left breast for saliva using an amylase test. The DNA profile from that sample included Blair as a possible contributor. Under her fingernails, they recovered blood. Ewing was the major DNA source, but tests showed a minor contributor profile that again could be Blair. Statistically, that mixed profile would be expected in only about 1 in 1,400 African Americans, and Blair is African American. At that moment, police had a body, an area known for prostitution, and partial DNA that pointed toward Blair. But they didn't yet have the full pattern. They didn't know they'd soon be led to more bodies, not by witnesses on the street, but by the killer himself. On September 2, 2004, the smell hit first. A Kansas City officer was checking out a foul odor near 26th and Montgall. Following the scent of decomposition, he entered a detached garage at 2609 Montgall. Inside, under a tarp, he found the body of Sheila Mackenzie. Beneath her, concealed even further, lay the badly decomposed remains of Patricia Wilson. Mackenzie's body was positioned like someone had stripped her of dignity in stages. She was nude from the ankles to the clavicle. Her dress and t-shirt were bunched up around her neck and shoulders, not worn, but pushed, exposing almost her entire body. Her neck had been broken, and the forensic exam showed evidence of strangulation. Manual, close contact, violent. Investigators tracked blood back from the garage to a nearby house under renovation at 2617 Montgall. Inside, Mackenzie's blood was found on the carpet, indicating she was either assaulted or killed there and then dragged into the garage for concealment. The autopsy and lab work made the scene even more damning. Material from under Mackenzie's fingernails revealed male DNA, Semen on both of her thighs and on rectal and vaginal swabs was tested and identified as Terry Blair's DNA. An acid phosphatase test, used to detect seminal fluid, showed that Blair had ejaculated into Mackenzie within about 1 day of her body being found. Expert testimony at trial explained how gravity causes semen to leak from the vaginal vault, and how clothing rubbing against the skin can slough off a person's DNA. The court concluded that Mackenzie's last conscious act was intercourse with Blair. If she had survived long after, she likely would have urinated, cleaned herself, or moved in ways that would have removed or smeared much of that semen. Instead, the pattern suggested she was killed in or near the house, then moved while dead. Underneath her, Patricia Wilson's body told its own story. She was so badly decomposed that the medical examiner could not identify a specific cause of death, but the fact that she was deliberately concealed, hidden under Mackenzie, stacked in a garage, wrapped and covered, led authorities to rule her death a homicide. Wilson's blood was smeared on the kitchen floor at 26 to 17 Montgall, the same house where Mackenzie's blood marked the carpet. The shared location and concealment pattern tied their deaths directly together. The court later drew a chilling inference. Blair's identity as Wilson's killer is established not just by words, but by behavior. He knew where her body was. He chose to hide Mackenzie's body on top of Wilson's. You don't stack a fresh body on a concealed, decomposed one unless you already know what's beneath the tarp. But the most direct connection to Wilson and Mackenzie didn't come from the blood or the garage. It came from the phone. On September 3, 2004, at approximately 10:39 p.m., an unidentified male called 911 from a deactivated T-Mobile cell phone that had no SIM card, no assigned number, no subscriber information, nothing that could be traced in the usual ways. Even without a SIM, the phone could still dial 911. The caller reported a dead body at 29th and Park, in the backyard of the northeast house on the corner. That would later be confirmed as the remains of Carmen Hunt. When the dispatcher asked him how he knew a body was there, the man answered simply, "I put it there." He refused to identify himself. Pressed a second time on how he knew, he went further. "Because I put the 2 on 25th and Montgall, and I put that there." He wasn't just claiming Carmen. He was taking credit for the 2 women in the Montgall garage, Mackenzie and Wilson. Police responded to 29th and Park and found what the caller said they would. The skeletal remains of Carmen Hunt, lying in an overgrown area behind 2905 Park, covered in carpet and brush. The medical examiner determined she had been dead for at least a week, and like Wilson and some others, her death was ruled a homicide because her body had been concealed. During this same call, when the dispatcher asked how he killed the woman at 29th and Park, the caller replied, "Killed them." The rest of the sentence was partly inaudible, but the meaning was clear. The court later treated this as a confession to Hunt's murder, supported by the physical reality of her body being exactly where he said it would be. By then, police knew they were not just dealing with dumped bodies and neighborhood rumors. They had a voice, confident, calm, and chillingly matter-of-fact, placing himself at 3 murder scenes. And he wasn't done. The next evening, September 4th, 2004, at 6:51 p.m., the same man called 911 again, using the same stolen T-Mobile phone. He opened by reminding them who he was. He told the dispatcher he had called the previous day to report bodies, and that he was calling back to report 2 more bodies. The first was at 24th and Prospect, he said, in the alley right next to the gate by the U-Haul place, covered with black vinyl. This would later be identified as Darcy Williams. The second was at 27th and Olive, covered with brush and pillows. That body would later be identified as Claudette Juniel. He told the dispatcher the women were prostitutes, and that he killed them because they were scum and a disgrace. Then he upped the horror. "You can smell her." The caller also referenced the body at 23rd and Prospect, Anna Ewing, saying they had found her a long time ago. And when the dispatcher asked if he had killed that woman too, he answered, "Yeah, and I have more." These weren't random tips. This was a man mapping his own crime scenes over the phone. Police took the second call seriously and literally. At about 7:30 p.m. on September 4, 2004, officers went to the described location near 24th and Prospect. There, lying in brush outside a fenced parking lot with U-Haul advertising banners visible in crime scene photos, they found the body of Darcy Williams. She was badly decomposed, hidden beneath roofing tar paper. A black knit shirt was tied around her neck. Her mother later testified that she met Darcy every Wednesday. The last time she saw her daughter was between 3:30 and 4 p.m. on August 25, 2004, when she dropped Darcy off at 25th and Prospect. Darcy stepped out of the car, crossed the street, and approached three men. One of them was Terry Blair. Her mother never spoke to her again. The decomposition was advanced enough that the cause of death could not be definitively determined, but the medical examiner ruled her death a homicide because of the very deliberate concealment of the body, combined with the 911 caller's precise directions, and later evidence linking that caller to Blair. The court treated his phone admission about the body at 24th and Prospect as direct evidence supporting Blair's conviction for Darcy's murder. That same day, officers followed the rest of the caller's instructions to 27th and Olive. In a vacant lot at 27 to 45 Olive, they found the skeletal remains of Claudette Juniel. She was nude, her body covered with couch cushions, sticks, and a tire, hidden so thoroughly that officers later testified they would never have found her without the 911 caller's directions. A shirt was tied around her neck, echoing the ligature and strangulation signatures seen elsewhere in the case. Her death, too, was classified as a homicide because of the deliberate concealment. On the phone, the man had described her as one of two more bodies. When the dispatcher pressed him, "Who are these people that you buried, sir?" "These people are prostitutes." "Okay, why did you kill these prostitutes?" "Because they are scum. They're a disgrace." Those recordings would later be played in court, the voice identified as Blair's, his own words weaponized against him. For Sheila Mackenzie, the evidence chain was brutal and precise. Last seen alive by her mother around 11 a.m. on September 2, 2004. Found that same day in a garage at 2609 Montgall. Nude from ankles to clavicle, neck broken, signs of strangulation. Her blood in a nearby house under renovation at 26 to 17 Montgall. Blair's semen in her vagina, rectum, and on her thighs, consistent with ejaculation within 1 day of her body being found. Blair's complete denial that he even knew her, or had sex with her. Something the court read as a powerful consciousness of guilt. For Patricia Wilson, her body had been placed under Mackenzie's, concealed, decomposed. Her blood on the kitchen floor at 2617 Montgall, the same house connected to Mackenzie. The 911 caller explicitly taking credit for the two on 25th and Montgall, tying her directly to Blair. For Anna Ewing, found July 14, 2004 at 2608 East 23rd Street. Nude except for bra and knitted garment around her neck, with abrasions and bruising. Partial saliva DNA on her left breast, and mixed DNA under her fingernails that included Blair as a possible contributor, with a rarity estimate of 1 in 1/400. A 911 call on September 4th, where the caller admits he was also responsible for the one on 23rd and Prospect that police had found a long time ago. For Darcy Williams, last seen by her mother on August 25, 2004 at 25th and Prospect, walking directly toward a group of men that included Blair. Found September 4th, in brush outside a fenced lot near 24th and Prospect, hidden under roofing tar paper with a shirt around her neck. Location given in precise detail by the 911 caller. For Carmen Hunt, her skeletal remains found September 4th, 2004 behind 2905 Park, covered by carpet and brush, dead at least a week. Direct 911 admission, "I put it there," followed by acknowledgement that he killed her. For Claudette Juniel, skeletal, nude, covered with cushions, sticks, and a tire in a vacant lot at 2745 Olive. Police confirmed they would not have located her without the caller's directions. The 911 caller openly stating he killed these prostitutes because they were scum and a disgrace. Layered on top of that was the technical work tying the 911 calls to Blair. All calls came from a stolen T-Mobile phone with no SIM card, tracked via its IMEI number. Cell tower analysis placed the August 30th hang-up and the September 4th call near the tower at 3330 Roanoke, directly north of Blair's sister's duplex at 1340 West Bluff. Test calls from in front of his mother's apartment at 2449 Prospect replicated the same latitude and longitude as the September 3rd call. Background sounds in the September 4th call, children playing and a train horn, matched the physical surroundings near his sister's complex and a train that blew its horn at 6:53 p.m., 2 minutes into the 6:51 call. A linguistics professor identified the voice as a native English-speaking, urban African-American male from a lower middle to upper working class background, a profile Blair fit exactly. And then there was the witness Cherry Chadbourne, who flagged down officers on September 6, 2004, and told them Blair had said he was going to kill all prostitutes one by one because they were the scum of the earth, and that he had killed his first wife because she became a prostitute. Her account mirrored the language the 911 caller used on the tapes almost word for word. On September 10, 2004, while Blair was at a friend's house, his face appeared on a newscast as a person of interest in the Prospect murders. The friend pretended not to recognize him, waited until he left, and then called the police. When Blair later returned and hid in the garage, officers found him wedged between the rear of a car and the back wall, trying to avoid detection, a final physical act of hiding that matched the way he had hidden the women he killed. Officers proceeded to arrest Terry Blair and took him into custody. He was charged with 8 counts of murder in the first degree, 1 count of assault in the first degree, and 3 counts of forcible rape. What followed was a 7-hour interrogation, part of which was being filmed by a reality television crew that had been granted access by the Kansas City Police Department. The only surviving footage, however, comes from the edited television broadcast. The full original recording was later lost. What remains is partial, fragmented, and incomplete, a glimpse into the room, not a full record of it. But even in those fragments, Blair's statements, not his posture or tone, but his words, became powerful pieces of evidence. From the start, Blair's strategy was complete denial. Detectives showed him photographs of the victims, women whose bodies were discovered in garages, vacant lots, alleyways, and yards across the Prospect corridor. Blair responded by denying that he knew any of them. Not one, not Anna Ewing, not Sheila McKinsey, not Patricia Wilson, not Carmen Hunt, not Darcy Williams, not Claudette Junial. None of them, he said, had any connection to him. When asked whether he had ever been with them sexually, he said no. He said the only prostitute he had ever paid was a woman named Peaches, back in 2002. He insisted that he had never had sexual contact with any of the victims. This denial stood in stark contrast to the overwhelming forensic evidence. Seminal fluid recovered from inside Sheila McKenzie's body, semen recovered from her thighs, and male DNA under her fingernails, all linked directly to Blair. But in the interrogation room, he continued to deny it. Detectives shifted to the locations. They asked him whether he had been at the garages, houses, alleys, and lots where the women were found. Blair said no again. He denied ever having been at several of the crime scenes, even though blood, carpet transfer, concealment techniques, and body placement patterns suggested intimate familiarity with those sites. His words contradicted physical evidence, but he held the line. He had never been there. Then detectives confronted him about the 911 calls. By this point, analysts had traced the calls to 2 cell towers, one at 18th and Prospect, just north of his mother's residence at 2449 Prospect, one at 3330 Roanoke, just north of his sister's duplex at 1340 West Bluff. Test calls placed from those addresses by law enforcement produced identical latitude and longitude readings to the ones generated when the anonymous caller phoned 911. Despite this, Blair denied being the caller. He claimed he had not dialed 911. He said he had no involvement with the anonymous voice who provided detailed directions to the bodies. This denial came even after he placed himself at the exact locations during the exact windows the calls were made, a contradiction documented in the appellate record. He denied knowing the victims. He denied having sex with them. He denied being present at the crime scenes. He denied killing anyone. He denied everything the evidence showed. The appellate court later noted that these denials, repeated against DNA, autopsy results, cell tower analysis, eyewitness testimony, and Blair's own prior statements, demonstrated a clear consciousness of guilt, an attempt to distance himself from every link in the chain, even when the chain was already wrapped around him. In the end, the interrogation produced no confession, no admission, and no cooperation. What it produced, and what held up in court, was the pattern. A man confronted with the faces of 6 dead women. A man confronted with scientific evidence of sexual contact. A man confronted with phone calls that tracked directly to his family's homes. A man confronted with the precise recorded voice used to guide officers from corpse to corpse. Prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty in exchange for Blair waiving his right to a jury trial, and thus, Judge John O'Malley oversaw the bench trial. 2 of the murder charges, for Sandra Reed and Nelia Harris, were dropped. The rape and assault charges were also dropped. Judge O'Malley ruled Blair guilty on March 27, 2008, and he was sentenced to 6 life sentences with no possibility of parole for these 6 murders.
She too was found shoeless like all the victims and placed in a suggestive pose. Her body contained the semen of the defendant and no one else.
The crime started back in 1977 and spanned 3 decades.
Women between 1977 and 1993.
Lorenzo Gilliard is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of murder in the first degree for the deaths of Catherine Berry,
for the murders of Catherine Berry,
Naomi Kelly,
Ann
Barnes,
Kelly Ford, and Sheila Ingold.
And Carmeline Hibbs.
J. Gilliard of Black Male 524 of 50 regarding the following homicide. Now I'm going to again show you his photographs and just ask you a couple of questions about it. The first photograph I'm showing you is Sheila Ingold that was discovered on November the 3rd, 1987. Do you know Miss Ingold?
Not to my knowledge, no, I don't.
Have you ever had any contact with her?
Not that I know. I can remember, no.
This is a photograph of Stacy Swafford. It was discovered on 4/17/77. And with your initials, did you indicate that you did not know Stacy Swafford?
Not to my knowledge, I didn't know her.
Have you ever had physical contact?
Not to my knowledge, no.
For more than 15 years, women kept turning up dead across Kansas City, Missouri. Their bodies were discovered in empty parks, abandoned buildings, and vacant lots across the city. The cause of death was the same way for each victim. Their airways cut off after someone squeezed the life out of them. At first, detectives believed the murders were unrelated. But when investigators reopened the cold cases decades later, they noticed something chilling. The same man's DNA kept appearing again, and again, across multiple murder scenes. Different victims, different years, the same killer. By the time police realized what they were looking at, the evidence pointed to 13 victims, and the man responsible had been living quietly in Kansas City the entire time. His name is Lorenzo Gilliard, and what investigators were about to uncover would expose a hidden trail of murders stretching back more than 15 years. It all started with a single body discovered in Kansas City in 1977, a case that at the time no one realized was the beginning of something far more sinister. On the afternoon of April 17, 1977, the quiet residential blocks near 45th Street and Euclid Avenue in Kansas City were interrupted by a disturbing discovery. A man walking through the neighborhood noticed something unusual in a vacant lot, an overgrown patch of grass where a house once stood. The lot still contained the old foundations and concrete stairways of the demolished home. It was the kind of forgotten space people passed every day without looking too closely. But this time, someone looked. Lying in the grass was the nude body of a young woman. Police were called immediately. When officers arrived, they found the victim sprawled across the grassy hill of the vacant lot. Bruising was visible around her neck. A white cloth had been tied around her right wrist, suggesting that she had been restrained before she died. Investigators quickly determined she had been killed hours earlier, possibly up to 12 hours before her body was discovered. She was later identified through fingerprints as 17-year-old Stacy L. Swafford, who had been living at 2201 East 72nd Street. Stacy had been missing from home for months. According to family members, the last time her parents had seen her alive was Easter of 1977. By then, she had already left home and had begun living on the streets of Kansas City, surviving as a prostitute. Her life had slowly unraveled in the months before her death, and now she had died in the same streets where she had been trying to survive. Her body was transported to Truman Medical Center, where an autopsy was scheduled, but the investigation immediately ran into problems. Detectives struggled to determine exactly where the killing had occurred. The vacant lot where Stacy's body was discovered may not have been the actual crime scene, and without knowing where the attack happened, investigators had little physical evidence to work with, as Sergeant Al Lomax later explained. Locating the true crime scene was often the key to solving a homicide. That's where the physical evidence is, Lomax said. Everybody makes a mistake, and generally those mistakes are at the location of the murders. But in Stacy's case, police had very little to go on. Police canvassed the surrounding neighborhood, searching for clothing or evidence that might have been left behind. Residents were interviewed. No one reported seeing anything suspicious. For detectives, the investigation quickly stalled. At the time, police believed the killing may have been connected to the dangerous world Stacy had been living in. Officers considered several possibilities: a violent customer, a dispute over money, or even a conflict involving a pimp. A police officer later explained that one theory involved a pimp who wanted Stacy to work for him instead of another man, but none of those leads produced solid evidence. 8 months after the killing, police arrested 2 men, Willie Williams and Lucillus Betts, in connection with Stacy's death. Detectives believed they had finally made progress, but when the case was presented to a Jackson County grand jury, the evidence fell apart. The grand jury refused to return indictments, and both men were released. The only person who had claimed to witness Stacy's killing was 21-year-old Brenda Lockett, a woman described by her own mother as a streetwalker struggling with a heroin addiction. Her testimony was unreliable. Police later admitted the witness had contradictions in her story, and prosecutors ultimately concluded she was not credible enough to support a murder charge. The case went cold. But the violence surrounding the investigation didn't end there. In October 1978, the same woman who had been the key witness in Stacy's murder, Brenda Lockett, was found dead. Her body was discovered on the back porch of a vacant house at 3318 Wayne Avenue. She had been shot in the head. Neighbors reported hearing gunshots around 2 in the morning. To police, the message was unmistakable. The only witness to Stacy Swafford's killing had just been murdered. With the witness gone and the evidence thin, the investigation collapsed completely. The death of 17-year-old Stacy Swafford became just another unsolved homicide. At the time, detectives had no reason to believe they were looking at the beginning of a serial killing spree. But years later, when investigators reopened the case and began comparing old evidence, they would realize something disturbing. Stacy Swafford had not been killed in isolation. He had been the first known victim of a man who would quietly continue killing women in Kansas City for years, and for a long time, no one realized he was out there. Winter nights along Kansas City's east side had a rhythm that rarely changed. After dark, the traffic along Troost Avenue slowed to a crawl as cars rolled past liquor stores, aging storefronts, and dimly lit intersections where people gathered beneath flickering streetlights. Music drifted from open car windows, and conversations echoed outside late-night convenience stores. For many women in the area, these streets had become the center of survival. Some were pumping dope in their veins. Others had no stable place to live. Many were simply trying to earn enough money to get through another night and please their pimps. Among the ones moving through that world was 15-year-old Gwendolyn Kazine. Like others who spent time near Troost Avenue, she often relied on brief encounters with drivers who slowed their cars along the curb. A window would lower, a short conversation would follow, and she'd hop in the passenger door before the vehicle pulled away into the darkness. Those encounters rarely lasted long, but for the women stepping inside those cars, every ride carried uncertainty. At some point during the night in January 1980, Gwendolyn encountered a man whose identity would remain unknown for years. Investigators would later determine that during that encounter, her breathing had been deliberately cut off. What happened during those final moments remains unclear, and detectives were never able to determine exactly where the attack took place. The next morning, January 23, 1980, someone moving near 31st Street and Troost Avenue noticed a body near a vacant structure. Authorities responded to the scene and secured the area while detectives began documenting the surroundings. The victim was soon identified as Gwendolyn Kazine. Investigators carefully searched the immediate area for signs of a struggle or evidence the attacker might have left behind, but the location offered little. Detectives quickly began to suspect that the spot where Gwendolyn had been found was not where the attack had actually occurred. If she had been killed somewhere else and then transported, the most valuable evidence could be miles away, or already lost. At the time, the case appeared to be an isolated homicide involving a vulnerable teenager moving through a dangerous environment. No witnesses had come forward, and no suspect had been identified. Yet somewhere in Kansas City, the person responsible had already shown a willingness to approach strangers in the night and disappear just as quickly. For him, the encounter had lasted only minutes. For investigators, the unanswered questions would remain for decades. The next body was discovered on the morning of May 9, 1982. When authorities arrived and began examining the scene, it quickly became clear that the death they were investigating was not accidental. The victim was identified as 17-year-old Margaret Miller. Margaret had been living in circumstances that forced many young girls onto the streets long before they were prepared to navigate that world. Detectives soon learned that she had been earning money through prostitution, placing her in the same late-night environment where strangers met briefly and disappeared without leaving much trace behind. Sometime before her body was discovered, Margaret encountered someone who took advantage of that vulnerability. Medical examination later revealed that force had been applied to her neck, causing fatal asphyxiation. Authorities ruled the death a homicide. Investigators documented the scene carefully, photographing the surroundings and examining the position of the body. Yet the same problem that had complicated earlier investigations quickly emerged again. Detectives could not be certain that the location where Margaret had been found was the place where the attack had occurred. If she had been killed elsewhere and then left there, the trail of evidence might already have disappeared. As detectives worked to reconstruct Margaret's final hours, they attempted to determine where she had last been seen and who she might have encountered during the night. That process proved difficult. Many of the people moving through the same neighborhoods knew one another only briefly, often by nicknames or street identities. Encounters between strangers were common, and memories of those interactions rarely lasted beyond the moment. For investigators at the time, Margaret Miller's death appeared to be another tragic but separate homicide. No suspect had been identified, and nothing at the scene clearly connected the killing to any earlier case. Yet the circumstances of the attack revealed something troubling about the person responsible. Whoever had approached Margaret that night had been able to move through the same streets without drawing attention, appearing briefly, committing the crime, and disappearing again before anyone realized what had happened. The abandoned building where Catherine Barry was found had likely stood empty for years. Dust and debris covered the floors, and broken windows allowed cold air to move freely through the structure. It was inside that neglected property, on March 14, 1986, that authorities were called to investigate the body of a woman lying on the floor. The victim was identified as 34-year-old Catherine Barry. Catherine struggled with mental illness and unstable housing, often spending time near shelters and areas where other vulnerable people gathered. Unlike several earlier victims, investigators did not believe she was working as a prostitute, but her life still placed her in environments where she regularly crossed paths with strangers. When detectives examined the scene, they found that a stocking had been wrapped around Catherine's neck. Medical examiners later confirmed that her airway had been compressed, and authorities ruled the death a homicide. Investigators carefully documented the interior of the building, photographing the room and searching for anything that might identify the person responsible. Crime scene technicians examined nearby surfaces for fingerprints and collected any items that could potentially hold trace evidence. Once the scene had been processed, detectives turned their attention toward reconstructing Catherine's final movements. They didn't get far. Many of the individuals who knew Catherine moved between shelters, temporary housing, and various gathering places throughout the city. Establishing exactly where she had been during the hours before her death required investigators to track down multiple people whose own lives were constantly shifting. For the time being, Catherine Barry's death remained another unresolved homicide investigation. But the killing revealed something investigators had begun noticing more often in Kansas City. The person responsible had chosen victims who lived on the margins of society, people whose disappearances might not immediately trigger widespread alarm, and that realization would become increasingly important as the number of victims began to grow. Naomi Kelly was 23 years old when her life ended in the summer of 1986. She was attending business school and trying to build something more stable for herself. But the financial pressure surrounding her life had become overwhelming. Investigators later learned that those pressures had pushed her into prostitution, placing her in the same dangerous environment where predators roam. At some point before August 16th, Naomi encountered the man who already had 4 bodies to his name. Investigators would later determine that an object had been used to compress her neck, causing fatal asphyxiation. When her body was found in a Kansas City park, authorities secured the area and began processing the scene. Detectives soon focused on one detail that made this case stand out. A towel had been used in the attack, and it had been left near the body. Crime scene technicians photographed it, collected it, and examined the surrounding ground for anything else that might identify the killer. A public park, however, was not an easy place to work backward from. Too many people moved through such locations every day, and too much evidence could be contaminated, overlooked, or carried away before investigators arrived. As detectives attempted to reconstruct Naomi's last hours, they spoke with people who had seen her recently and reviewed the areas where she had been known to spend time. Establishing a clear timeline was challenging, not because no one had seen her, but because so many of the people who crossed paths with her had only known her in passing. They remembered fragments, a face, a car, a location, never enough to form a complete picture. Naomi Kelly's death added another name to a list that was beginning to weigh more heavily on detectives. Even if the cases had not yet been formally tied together, the person responsible was becoming more confident. He was no longer separated from his earlier crimes by years. By 1986, the violence was returning more often, and the city had not yet realized how much more of it was still to come. Thanksgiving Day of 1986 brought another grim scene to Kansas City. On November 27th, authorities were directed to bushes beside a church, where the body of a woman had been left partially concealed. The setting itself was jarring. A place associated with safety and refuge had become the backdrop for yet another homicide. The victim was identified as 32-year-old Deborah Sue Blevins. Like several of the women killed before her, Deborah had been living with instability and addiction and had become involved in prostitution. Those who knew her remembered someone who had lived a hard life but still tried to maintain connections with the people around her, even as the streets continued pulling her deeper into danger. Investigators noted that Deborah's body had been left completely nude, a detail that strongly suggested the attack involved sexual violence. Medical examination later confirmed that her breathing had been deliberately cut off. Crime scene technicians photographed the area surrounding the body, searched through the nearby brush, and collected anything that might connect a suspect to the scene. The killer's behavior was becoming harder to dismiss as random. He was not simply attacking women and fleeing. He was selecting locations where bodies would eventually be found, but not necessarily right away, leaving investigators to piece together what remained after time and exposure had already erased part of the story. That pattern made every hour between the attack and the discovery of a body work in his favor. By the end of 1986, Kansas City detectives had now worked through multiple killings of women under increasingly similar circumstances in a single year. The cases still sat in separate files, but the pace itself had become a fact no one could ignore. Whatever had begun years earlier had not ended. It was intensifying. Ann Barnes moved through a different side of Kansas City nightlife than some of the earlier victims. At 36, she worked as an exotic dancer and also engaged in prostitution, spending nights in clubs and bars where music, alcohol, and strangers blurred together until the early morning hours. Inside those establishments, men watched from the shadows. Conversations were short, and arrangements were often made with little more than a glance and a few quiet words. That environment offered the killer something the streets alone could not. In a club, he did not need to search as openly. Women and customers were already crossing paths in a place built around anonymity, temporary attention, and late-night departures. If a woman left with a man after her shift or after a conversation at the bar, few people would think twice about it. Sometime before April 17, 1987, Ann Barnes left with someone she encountered in that world. And at some point, someone choked the life out of her. Her body was found near the city center, and investigators responded by securing the area and documenting the scene. Detectives photographed the position of the body, examined the nearby ground, and began trying to identify anyone who might have seen Ann during the hours before she died. In theory, Ann's work should have made that easier. Clubs had staff, patrons, dancers, bartenders, and security, but nightlife came with its own investigative problem. No one wanted to be seen talking to police. With no help offered, the case ran cold, and unfortunately, the killer wasn't even close to stopping. The place where Kelly Ford was found gave the case an especially stark visual weight. On June 9, 1987, authorities were led to a location near one of Kansas City's parks. where her body had been left near the edge of a cliff. The terrain itself seemed chosen to isolate the scene from view. It was the kind of place someone could pass without ever looking down far enough to notice what had been left there. Kelly was 20 years old. She had struggled with addiction and had turned to prostitution, moving through the same late-night environment where several of the earlier victims had been surviving. For women in that world, isolation was often built into the encounter itself. The customer did not want witnesses. The woman needed the money. And so the meeting would shift from a public street to somewhere quieter, farther away, and more dangerous. Investigators determined that Kelly had been assaulted and that her airway had been compressed, causing fatal asphyxiation. They also noted that her body was almost completely nude. The location and condition of the scene suggested the killer had once again exerted control not just over the victim, but over how and where she would be found. Crime scene technicians processed the area carefully, taking photographs, measuring distances, and searching the ground for clothing, personal belongings, fibers, or anything else that might have been left behind. But natural terrain creates its own challenges. Wind, weather, and exposure can alter a scene quickly, and evidence in outdoor areas is easily lost. By the middle of 1987, the killer's behavior was becoming clearer even before police could formally prove the connection. He sought vulnerability, chose locations that reduced witnesses, and left investigators with scenes that were difficult to reconstruct. And he was still moving with enough freedom to kill again within months. Angela Mayhew's case stood apart the moment investigators saw the scene. She was 19 years old, and like several of the earlier victims, financial instability had pushed her into prostitution. But when her body was found on September 12, 1987, on the side of a road in Kansas City, detectives immediately noticed something different. Angela was fully clothed. That detail mattered, because it broke from the condition in which several other victims had been found. During the autopsy, medical examiners also determined that there was no evidence of sexual assault. Even so, one fact remained the same. Her breathing had been deliberately cut off. Detectives photographed the body's position and searched the roadside for any object or trace evidence that might identify the attacker. The scene forced them to consider several possibilities at once. Had the killer changed something about his behavior? Had the encounter unfolded differently than the others? Or had the body simply been left in a way that disguised what had happened before death? As investigators retraced Angela's movements, they again found themselves working through short encounters and unreliable timelines. People had seen her, but not long enough to place her with certainty alongside any one person. The killer was still benefiting from the same reality that had protected him for years. He did not need to stand out for long. He only needed a few minutes alone with a woman before vanishing back into the city. By the fall of 1987, the pace itself had become part of the story. Another victim was already waiting in the next chapter. 2 months later, police received a call about a van that had been sitting in the same spot for far too long. At a glance, it looked like the kind of abandoned vehicle people eventually learned to ignore. But when someone finally looked inside on November 3, 1987, the ordinary appearance ended. Inside the van was the body of 36-year-old Sheila Ingold. Medical examination later showed that Sheila's airway had been compressed, causing fatal asphyxiation. The scene revealed something else as well. 2 rings that Sheila had been wearing were missing. Investigators concluded that the killer had taken them after the attack, introducing another detail that made this case stand out from many of the others. As detectives worked backward from the van, they learned that the meeting leading to Sheila's death had been tied to the vehicle itself. The killer had reportedly pretended to be interested in buying the van, using that interest to create a reason for Sheila to enter the confined space with him. Once inside, he killed her. That detail revealed an unsettling progression in the offender's behavior. He was not only hunting vulnerable women, he was also finding ways to create controlled, believable situations that placed them exactly where he wanted them. It suggested planning, manipulation, and confidence. Detectives began tracing who had access to the vehicle and who had been seen near it during the relevant hours. But before the questions surrounding the van could be fully answered, another homicide investigation would again pull the city's attention elsewhere. The year was not over, and neither was he. By the time Carmeline Renee Hibbs was found, the year itself had started to feel heavy with repetition. On December 19, 1987, authorities were directed to the parking lot of an apartment building, where the body of a woman had been left outside. The victim was identified as 30-year-old Carmeline Renee Hibbs. Investigators noted that her body was partially nude, and she was assaulted in a sexual manner. The coroner advised the cause of death was asphyxiation, just like the others. Crime scene technicians photographed the body and searched the parking lot for evidence. Investigators canvassed the building, hoping someone had seen Carmeline with another person before her death. But like so many earlier cases, no one had anything useful to offer. As 1987 came to a close, Kansas City detectives were still searching for answers. The city entered a new year without realizing the killings had not truly ended, only paused. When Helga Kruger was killed in February 1989, her case did not seem to belong with the others. Helga was 26 years old and originally from Austria. Her life had taken her far from home and into legal trouble in the United States through a case involving extortion. Investigators found no indication that she had been working as a prostitute, which immediately set her apart from many of the earlier victims. On paper, her background did not fit the pattern detectives had been slowly wrestling with in Kansas City. Medical examination later showed that a towel had been used to squeeze the life out of her. Even so, at the time, detectives had little reason to immediately place her death within the same sequence of crimes that had been building across the city for years. That separation mattered. It showed how effectively the killer's behavior could hide in plain sight. As detectives continued to investigate, the case moved forward on its own track, disconnected from the others in any official sense. The Kansas City, Missouri Police Department realized they had a serial killer on their hands, but they were nowhere near catching him. And unfortunately, one more victim was still waiting in the future. The final known victim in Lorenzo Gilliard's trail of terror was found on January 11, 1993. In the opening days of 1993, snow had settled across parts of Kansas City, covering empty ground, roadside embankments, and neglected corners of the city in a layer of white that made everything look quieter than it really was. It was in those frozen conditions that authorities were directed to a snowdrift where the body of a woman had been left. She was identified as 29-year-old Connie Lynn Luther. Connie had been working as a prostitute, living in the same dangerous world that had already claimed many women before her. When investigators examined Connie's body, they found a makeshift noose fashioned from laces tied around her neck. Medical examination later confirmed that her airway had been compressed, and authorities ruled the death a homicide. As police traced her last known movements, they came up short. As in earlier investigations, the information that came back was fragmentary and unreliable. More than 15 years had now elapsed since the earliest killings in the sequence, and still no one knew that the same offender had been moving through Kansas City all along. That truth would only come later, when advances in forensic science finally allowed investigators to reopen what had been left unresolved for far too long. Once they did, the preserved evidence from multiple scenes would begin to point in the same direction, and when it finally did, Kansas City would learn his name. For years, the murders remained scattered across Kansas City police files. Different detectives had investigated them. Different crime scenes had been processed. Some cases were years apart. Each file told the story of a woman who had been found dead somewhere in the city, but there was never enough evidence to clearly identify the man responsible. By the late 1990s, many of those cases had quietly slipped into the category investigators refer to as cold cases, murders that remain open but where no immediate suspect exists. The evidence, however, had never been thrown away. Biological samples collected from several crime scenes, blood, hair, semen, and other trace material, had been preserved inside evidence lockers. At the time those crimes were investigated, the technology needed to fully analyze that evidence simply did not exist. But that was beginning to change. In February 2001, investigators in Kansas City started a new effort to re-examine old homicide evidence using modern DNA analysis. Detectives began reviewing evidence from 85 unsolved murders and sexual assault cases, extracting DNA profiles from material that had been collected years earlier. The goal was simple. If the same offender had been responsible for more than one crime, the DNA profiles might match. As technicians began running the samples through laboratory analysis, something significant started to appear. Investigators now knew something they had never been able to prove before. The murders were connected, but they still did not know who the DNA belonged to. Detectives entered the unknown DNA profile into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, a national database used to compare genetic evidence recovered from crime scenes against the profiles of known offenders. The hope was that the database might produce a match. It did not. The DNA profile did not belong to anyone already listed in the system. At the same time, the Kansas City Police Department's cold case squad began working through the old homicide files again, searching for investigative links between the victims. Detectives reviewed reports, photographs, and forensic notes from the original investigations, looking for anything that might point them toward a suspect. Then investigators discovered something important buried in the records of an earlier investigation. Back in 1987, during an inquiry connected to the murder of Sheila Ingold, police had obtained a blood sample from a man named Lorenzo Gilliard. At the time, the sample had not been connected to any homicide case. It had simply remained stored with other evidence collected during the investigation. Laboratory analysts extracted DNA from the preserved blood sample and entered the genetic profile into CODIS. The result was immediate. The DNA from Lorenzo Gilliard's blood matched the same unknown profile that investigators had recovered from the murder scenes. The genetic evidence tied him to 13 homicides in Kansas City between 1977 and 1993. What had once been a collection of unsolved murders stretching across 3 decades was now connected to a single individual. Police were already familiar with Lorenzo Gilliard. He had spent most of his life in Kansas City, and his name had appeared in law enforcement records for years before detectives ever connected him to a string of murders. To people who only knew him casually, he seemed unremarkable, a quiet man who worked steady jobs and moved through the city without attracting much attention. But inside police files, a very different pattern had been developing for decades. Gilliard's criminal history stretched back to the early 1970s. In 1973, he was convicted of simple assault, receiving a short jail sentence and probation. The following year, his name surfaced again when he was charged with sexual assaulting an exotic dancer near 27th and Troost. Later that same year, he was arrested for physical and sexual assault near Riverfront Park, a crime that ultimately resulted in a 9-month prison sentence. Throughout the late 1970s, his encounters with police continued. In 1977, he was charged with giving false information to police, and weeks later he faced another charge for withholding property, both resulting in fines and probation. By 1979, Gilliard was arrested again, this time for carrying weapons, a case that ended with another fine and a year of probation. The pattern escalated in the early 1980s. In 1981, he was charged with non-residential burglary and aggravated assault, which led to a short stint in the Missouri Department of Corrections. 2 years later, in 1983, he was again arrested, this time for making a bomb threat, which led to a sentence of 1 to 4 years in prison for making a terroristic threat. By the mid-1980s, Gilliard had built a long record of arrests, probation violations, and prison sentences tied to assault, sexual offenses, burglary, and threats of violence. Yet despite that history, he was living in Kansas City, working regular jobs and moving largely unnoticed through the same neighborhoods where many of the victims would later be found. With the new DNA evidence, and for the first time, detectives were no longer looking for an unknown predator moving through the city. They knew exactly who he was. Police now had probable cause to arrest Lorenzo, and that's exactly what they did. In the latter half of April 2004, Lorenzo was arrested and charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of capital murder. He never confessed to what he did despite the overwhelming evidence against him. In January 2007, Gilliard's attorneys were able to negotiate an agreement with the Jackson County Attorney's Office. In exchange for dropping the death penalty, Gilliard would agree to a trial without a jury, which began on March 5th of that year. Gilliard was tried on 7 first-degree murder charges. The most decisive evidence came from forensic scientists. Biological evidence preserved from several victims had been re-examined using modern DNA testing and compared to a blood sample taken from Gilliard years earlier. The genetic profiles matched. Experts testified that the statistical probability of the DNA belonging to someone other than Gilliard was astronomically small, linking him directly to multiple homicide scenes. Throughout the proceedings, Gilliard refused to admit his guilt and insisted on his innocence. 12 days later, Gilliard was sentenced to life in prison without parole for the murders of Berry, Kelly, Barnes, Ford, Ingold, and Hibbs. He was acquitted of killing Mayhew since only human hair and no semen were found on her body, and the results of a DNA analysis of said hair being inconclusive. For families who had waited decades, the verdict finally answered questions that had lingered for years. Evidence that once sat in cold case files had finally spoken in court. Today, Lorenzo Gilliard remains imprisoned under the life sentences imposed after his conviction. The investigation that led to his arrest and conviction stands as an example of how persistence, preserved evidence, and advances in forensic science can eventually bring resolution to crimes that once seemed lost to time. For the victims, however, the story is not defined by the man who committed the crimes. It is defined by the lives that were taken. Warning: the following program contains subject matter that may be disturbing to some audiences. Viewer discretion advised. You're listening to Descent to Depravity, where we investigate the darkest corners of the human psyche, one chilling story at a time.
Mr. Berdella, you're sitting here as a man who's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. You've confessed to 6 young men in this city and crimes that horrified the city and much of the country. Your prosecutors, and I do want to quote this, when you came to plead, called your crimes wantonly vile, horrible, or inhuman.
I think if you check with just about any attorney, you'll find that that is the standard clause that's used when they went to build a case for Capital One with the death penalty.
The house on Charlotte Street never invited suspicion. It sat there unremarkable, quiet, and easily overlooked, while something far more malignant operated behind its walls. People walked past it daily, unaware that once someone crossed the threshold, the familiar rules of their world began to erode. Inside that space, fear didn't strike all at once. It infiltrated slowly, deliberately, until a person could no longer distinguish their own thoughts from the pressure closing in around them. For the men held inside, it started with small things they barely noticed. The way the light never seemed natural, the way the silence felt heavy, the way time seemed to stretch in a way their bodies didn't understand. Then came the commands, the monitoring, the constant watchfulness that made every breath feel examined. It wasn't violence that broke them first. It was the growing sense that they were being pulled out of themselves, inch by inch. Berdella never hurried. He waited for the precise moment a person understood that whatever control they once had was gone. He studied the tremor in their voice, the faltering in their speech, the vacant shift in their eyes when hope stopped feeling possible. He pushed limits intentionally, applying just enough pressure to make them doubt their own perceptions. The house amplified that doubt. It drained their sense of time, blurred their memories, and eroded any remaining certainty. In the end, the only thing they could rely on was the fear tightening in their chest. When the surviving victim finally broke free of that house, he wasn't escaping a single act of violence. He was running from physical torture, sadism, and a level of psychological torment that had stripped him nearly to the edge of collapse. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he struggled to stay present all made it clear that something far more calculated had been happening inside those walls. His escape forced investigators to confront a reality no one in the neighborhood had imagined, and it raised a deeper question. How did Robert Berdella become someone capable of creating that kind of environment? Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. was born on January 31st, 1949, in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, a suburb that seemed peaceful from the outside but proved uniquely hostile to a boy whose differences became targets before he understood what difference even meant. His father, Robert Berdella Sr., worked long, grueling hours as a die maker at the Ford Motor Company. Precise work that demanded mechanical discipline, emotional restraint, and the kind of rigid self-control he insisted his sons mirror. His mother, Maury Berdella, tried to maintain a conventional Catholic household, but the atmosphere inside their home never resembled the warm, forgiving picture the church painted. Robert grew up beneath a constant pressure system, expectations he could not meet, punishments he could not avoid, and a lingering awareness that he was not the son his father wanted. From a young age, Robert was frail, nearsighted, and plagued by illnesses that kept him inside when other children were building alliances on playgrounds. His thick glasses earned him ridicule at school. His awkward gait and solitary nature marked him instantly as a target. Berdella later described those early school years as a private battleground, where he was routinely shoved, mocked, and excluded. While other boys formed bonds through sports and neighborhood rituals, Robert retreated into books and television, finding refuge in stories where power could be seized quietly, where control belonged to those who observed rather than participated. He learned early that silence could be a weapon and withdrawal a strategy. The tension inside the Berdella home intensified as he grew older. His father favored his younger brother, Daniel, who had the athletic ability and personality Robert lacked. Robert felt that comparison every day, sharp, implicit, unmistakable. His father's discipline bordered on authoritarian, and Robert learned to study the man's moods with careful precision. He memorized the tempo of approaching footsteps, the difference between a question and an accusation, and the exact tone signaling when silence was safer than speaking. These early habits, observation, calculation, emotional dissection, became the psychological architecture that would later define his crimes. As adolescence took hold, Robert retreated even further into isolation. He was bullied relentlessly, called names, shoved into lockers, and denied any access to the social rhythms other teens took for granted. In this period, Berdella's internal world began to diverge sharply from ordinary teenage fantasy. He immersed himself in dark literature, medical texts, and films that fixated on captivity and control. Most notably, he encountered the 1965 film The Collector, a story about a socially isolated man who kidnaps a woman and justifies his violence as a form of companionship. Berdella would later admit this film did more than disturb him. It embedded a blueprint. He said it left a major impression, resurfacing in his memory years later when he transformed fantasy into method. School offered little sanctuary. Berdella's teachers noted his intelligence, but they also noted his coldness, his discomfort with peers, his sharp, guarded demeanor. He developed a reputation for being odd, polite but impenetrable, academically capable but emotionally distant. He rarely attended social events, avoided sports entirely, and showed early signs of resentment toward authority figures. By the time he graduated from high school, he was already cultivating a private belief system that placed him outside the reach of ordinary social rules. Overlaying all of this was an emerging awareness of his sexuality, an awareness he quickly learned to hide. In the conservative 1950s and 60s, any deviation from heterosexual norms invited danger. Berdella did not confide in anyone. Instead, he internalized the secrecy, adopting a posture of emotional concealment. During these years, Berdella began experimenting with behaviors that foreshadowed his later crimes. Manipulation of weaker peers, attempts to dominate conversation, and a fascination with the boundary between discomfort and obedience. While nothing he did crossed criminal lines, the patterns were unmistakable. He preferred relationships in which he controlled the terms. He gravitated toward individuals who relied on him, even in small ways, and he learned how admiration, dependency, and fear could be blended into a single tool. By the time Berdella left adolescence behind, he carried with him a worldview shaped by humiliation, control, secrecy, and intellectual superiority. He believed the world had mistreated him. He believed he was owed something, and he believed, dangerously, that with the right conditions he could design private spaces where he determined the rules, the language, the behavior, and ultimately the fate of those inside them. In 1967, Robert Berdella completed his schooling at Cuyahoga Falls High School. His academic record was strong enough that a teacher placed him in an independent study program the year before he graduated. After receiving his diploma, he moved to Kansas City and registered at the Kansas City Art Institute, intending to pursue a future in higher education. During his first year at the Art Institute, instructors viewed him as diligent and capable. That changed during his second year. He began pushing back against school authority, fell in with a group known for drug use, and started selling those drugs to classmates. His drinking increased, and he carried out 2 documented acts of animal cruelty. In one instance, he cut a duck's head in front of fellow students. In another, he used sedatives and tranquilizers on a dog. When he was 19, police arrested Berdella for attempting to sell methamphetamine to an undercover officer. He posted $3,000 bail and later received a 5-year suspended sentence after pleading guilty. Only a month later, he and 2 other students were taken into custody in Johnson County for marijuana and LSD possession. Berdella spent 5 days in jail because he could not afford bond, and prosecutors dismissed the case due to insufficient evidence. In 1969, after administrators criticized him for killing and cooking a duck as part of an art piece, Berdella withdrew from the school on his own. He chose to remain in Kansas City and, that September, settled into a residence in the Hyde Park neighborhood at 4315 Charlotte Street. By this time, he had been openly gay for several years. He spent much of his time around male prostitutes, runaways, addicts, and individuals involved in low-level crime. Berdella often befriended them and claimed he tried to help them get away from drugs or criminal behavior, stating that during most of the 1970s he did not engage in physical relationships with them. He told neighbors he felt like a guardian to many of these young men. By the early 1980s, the older people in his life had drifted away, and Berdella relied more heavily on younger, transient acquaintances for company. He later said he grew irritated when these individuals did not appreciate what he viewed as his attempts to help them change their behavior. Despite those statements, Berdella routinely had sexual encounters with the young men he took under his wing. He kept influence over several of them by offering money, providing a place to stay without rent, and extending other favors that kept them close to him. 1982, Berdella leased a booth at the Westport Flea Market, naming it Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, where he dealt in primitive art, jewelry, and assorted antiques. The booth sometimes generated strong income, but not reliably enough to cover all his costs. To compensate, he occasionally stole or scavenged items for resale and allowed lodgers to stay at his Charlotte Street residence to help with expenses. While working at the flea market, Berdella became acquainted with merchant Paul Howell, whose booth was next to his. Through Howell, he met the younger son, Jerry Howell. Although Jerry and his friends initially mocked Berdella for being openly gay, Berdella later claimed that Jerry eventually told him that he and his friends sometimes worked as male prostitutes. By the early 1980s, Paul Howell had moved his business to a storefront near 39th and Main Street, where the family lived in an apartment above the shop. Berdella stayed loosely connected to the family and occasionally helped Jerry with minor legal troubles. By the summer of 1984, Jerry Howell was 19 years old. By the time Jerry Howell climbed into Berdella's car, July 5, 1984, a quiet hostility had already been building beneath the surface. Berdella had grown bitter toward Freddie Kellogg and Foster Simmons, 2 men he believed had drained him of money, favors, and time. He brought up the Camaro he had repossessed from Kellogg, a dead machine hidden away in Parkville, waiting for someone to coax it back to life. Howell had agreed earlier in the day to ride out there with him, but the plan changed the moment Howell opened the passenger door. He told Berdella he wasn't interested in Parkville anymore. He needed to be at a dance contest around 7, and he wanted to party first. The request for pills came almost immediately. Berdella obliged, offering up Valium and Ace Promazine from his stash. They picked up a 6-pack of Coors, and Howell began swallowing tablets one after another before they ever reached the house on Charlotte Street. The deeper the night sank, the more Howell asked for. Inside the house, he wanted stronger chemicals, something that would fog out the rest of the world. Berdella later admitted he lied about the potency of the pills he handed over next. He chose doses heavy enough to crush Howell's awareness. Within minutes, the effects took hold: slurred words, uneven balance, a slow collapse into the bed upstairs. Berdella believed Howell owed him, for rides, for money, for broken promises. Howell had said he'd help repay those debts more than once, then simply walked away from the agreement. Tonight, when he refused to go to Parkville, something inside Berdella snapped. Outwardly, he kept his voice steady. Inside, anger surged. The upstairs bedroom swallowed Howell whole. The diary, one of the many items detectives would later recover, recorded the timeline without emotion. 6:40 p.m. Howell went fully under after downing pill after pill. His body slackened across the bedding, and his breathing grew thick and uneven. 20 minutes later came the next step. The entry marked 7 p.m. referred to 1cc pH arm, a note that corresponded to a strong tranquilizer originally given to Berdella by one of Howell's friends. They disliked the drug because it hit hard and fast. Berdella injected it directly into Howell's arm, while the young man was already unconscious. There was no resistance. Howell had already left the world behind. The upstairs room stayed silent except for the diminishing sound of breath, the timestamp, the chemicals, the quiet obedience of a body too overwhelmed to fight. Every detail of the night unfolded in the neat, dispassionate handwriting of the man who recorded it. And as the sedatives spread through Howell's bloodstream, the house at 4315 Charlotte Street settled into the kind of stillness that comes only when someone inside it can no longer move, speak, or wake. By the time the upstairs bedroom settled into its nighttime stillness, Jerry Howell's consciousness had already been stripped away by the mix of pills and the injection given at 7. But Berdella wasn't finished. The diary, later recovered by detectives, showed that the first injection only marked the beginning of a sequence he had already decided to follow. The next entries came in rapid succession. 7:25 p.m., another injection. 7:30 p.m. 2 shots of chlorpromazine pushed directly into Howell's system. 7:55 p.m. 3 shots of chlorpromazine, forcing his body deeper into chemical paralysis. An additional 11 shots of chlorpromazine, this time delivered into the muscle of the lower body. Each dosage was recorded the instant it was administered, the handwriting steady, deliberate, unhurried. By 8:40 p.m., the diary shifted from individual injections to totals. 29 injections of chlorpromazine circled in the margin, marking the cumulative amount Howell had been forced to absorb. Minutes later, another 11 injections was noted without comment. Then came the entry that changed everything. 8:45. Tied. This was the moment Jerry Howell stopped being a struggling body and became something far more helpless. Secured spread out across the bed, wrists and ankles lashed to keep him from even unconscious movement. Before the restraints, his body had still twitched involuntarily, reacting to the chemical storm pumping through his veins. Afterward, nothing. Total stillness. The drugs had collapsed whatever remained of his ability to resist, and the ropes made sure he would never reclaim it. The entries that followed, marked at 9:10, used the letter F. Investigators later confirmed this was Berdella's code for assault. By 11:30 p.m., the deterioration began to show in ways Berdella could not ignore. The diary recorded vomiting, a dangerous development for someone lying flat, unconscious, and unable to turn his head. Berdella later admitted he likely knew the risk: aspiration, suffocation, the body shutting down. But he claimed he operated on automatic pilot, going through motions without stopping to intervene. The documentation shows he continued writing even as Howell's body fought to stay alive. Few lines later came another entry. Eyes blank. It was a clinical observation. Berdella inspected Howell's pupils and noted they had constricted to pinpoints, unmoving even when he tried directing light toward them. It was the kind of detail a person records only when studying the progress of a body slipping away. The next coded mark, BF at 11:45 p.m., represented yet another time Howell was violated. It stood as cold shorthand for an act Howell could not react to, stop, or even sense. The letters sat alone on the line, paired with the timestamp, a reminder that the night had not paused even as Howell's life was fading beneath the weight of drugs, restraints, and escalating violence. By this point, Jerry Howell was no longer capable of waking, moving, or understanding what was happening to him. The drugs had ended his ability to breathe steadily, and the room remained silent except for the sound of a body shutting down under the pressure of chemicals and restraint. And still, the notes continued. 12:30 p.m., Howell was assaulted, then again at 1:30 a.m., 2:30 a.m., 4:30 a.m., and 6:30 a.m., each labeled as BF. By morning, the cruelty took another turn. A notation at 8:40 a.m. contained 2 letters, CF. It referred to an object in the room used to violate Howell in another manner. Berdella later admitted the meaning, an improvised intrusion using a common vegetable. The diary recorded it the same way it recorded injections: clinical, automatic, stripped of emotion. Around 11 Howell received yet another injection. By then, his body could barely regulate anything: breath, reflex, or awareness. Berdella left the house with Howell still tied to the bed, still gagged, still deteriorating under the accumulation of drugs. He returned at 3 p.m. and administered another mixture of tranquilizers, layering chemicals on top of a system already collapsing. At 5:15, the diary recorded RP, indicating Howell had regained enough awareness to protest being weakly. In response, Berdella prepared 2 massive injections into Howell in an attempt to silence the emerging signs of life. Howell's condition did not stabilize. By 5:40, the writings described him still struggling faintly, his eyes fixed, his lips barely moving. Another notation, cucumber R, marked another instance of using an object found nearby. Berdella later said it was chosen simply because it was within reach and could be used for assault. The last hours came slowly. At 9:45, the entry front F, another way Berdella violated Howell, appeared. Berdella explained it as using the upper thighs as a point of friction. Howell could no longer fight in earnest. His attempts to resist came in tiny, fading spasms. Then in the final column of the page, the moment appeared without emotion or elaboration. Then at 10 p.m., Howell was dead. Robert Sheldon drifted into Berdella's orbit through Freddie Kellogg and Foster Simmons, 2 familiar faces from the Quincy Research Center. When an experimental program at Quincy ended, the group decided to celebrate at Berdella's house. Word spread that Berdella could administer thorazine injections, and he supplied them willingly. It was his way of staying close to the people who moved through Westport's back rooms and bars. He later admitted that a strict anti-drug stance had kept him on the margins for years, and that keeping pharmaceuticals nearby made it easier to be welcomed into gay and bisexual social circles, where substances flowed freely. Sheldon drifted in and out of the house over the months that followed. He sometimes paid rent, sometimes didn't. His drinking was constant. When he burned through his money, Berdella asked him to leave until he could put together enough to cover the cost of staying. One such period occurred in the winter of 1984, and again in early 1985, long after Jerry Howell had already vanished without a trace. The dates blurred in Berdella's mind until detectives handed him a 1985 calendar, a calendar he had filled with notations in his own hand. One entry in January read, RS on binge. Sheldon was known to drink hard, but he usually made some effort to repay Berdella, sometimes showing up with a check or making excuses for delays. Unlike Howell, he hadn't repeatedly broken promises or failed to follow through on agreements. In early April, that changed. On April 10, 1985, Sheldon appeared at the doorstep once more, asking if he could stay a couple of nights. Berdella allowed him inside. The calendar, and 4 sheets of notes recovered later, marked the moment things shifted. At the top of the first page was the date, 4:10. The first line read 9:30 asleep. Sheldon had fallen asleep on the first-floor couch. By that time, Berdella had already made up his mind. Around 9:30 that evening, he decided to drug Sheldon and keep him there. He approached with syringes and delivered injections into Sheldon's arm and shoulder. Sheldon, half lost in alcohol and exhaustion, brushed at the stings as if shooing away an insect. The chemicals didn't take hold as quickly as they had with Howell. Sheldon drifted in and out, mumbling, unaware that he was being pulled toward the same fate. The reason for targeting Sheldon, in Berdella's own later recounting, had nothing to do with attraction. He described Sheldon's repeated arrivals without warning, expecting shelter, food, or space on the couch. He considered it bothersome, an intrusion. And the urge that had overtaken him with Howell, an impulse he said began without clear explanation, was stirring again. Final injection at 12:30 a.m. did little to change Sheldon's state. When Berdella went upstairs briefly, Sheldon got up, wandered through the house, and complained of a sharp sensation in his back. He stumbled toward the kitchen, lost his footing, and fell. Eventually, he returned to the couch, confused and unsteady. The attempt to subdue him failed, and Berdella abandoned the effort for the night. By morning, Sheldon complained of muscle pain, likely from the injections he had unknowingly received. Berdella drove him to the University of Kansas Medical Center, where Sheldon had previously been treated after a bar fight. Doctors examined him, prescribed antibiotics, and released him. Sheldon spent that night again at the Charlotte Street house, unaware of how close he had come to a far darker outcome. The next day, Friday, April 12th, Berdella left for work as usual. When he returned that evening, he found Sheldon drunk once again. He pulled out the earlier notes on Sheldon and began writing fresh entries, picking up exactly where he had left off during the failed attempt the night before. Whatever restraint he believed he'd regained earlier had vanished. The idea of capturing and controlling Sheldon had returned with a clarity that would carry the night forward. Robert Sheldon's second night in the house on Charlotte Street began with a simple request. He asked Berdella for a Valium. Instead of handing him one, Berdella suggested taking one of the antibiotics Sheldon had been prescribed earlier at the hospital. When Sheldon agreed, Berdella broke open the capsule and dumped out the medicine. In its place, he filled the shell with powder from 5 crushed sedative pills. Sheldon swallowed it without suspicion. Within minutes, his body succumbed to the altered dose, and he slid into a heavy, unwakeable sleep. Once he was fully under, Berdella began administering injections of tranquilizers, pushing the chemicals deeper into Sheldon's system. By 9 p.m., Sheldon was completely unresponsive. Berdella rolled the unconscious man off the couch, removed his pants, tied his ankles together, and dragged the slack body up the staircase. On the landing between the second and third floors, he stopped long enough to give another mixture of sedatives, still experimenting, realizing by trial and error that a small amount of ketamine worked faster than any combination he had tried on Howell. At 10 p.m., he moved Sheldon into a third-floor bedroom, shutting the door behind him. Here, the notes darkened. By 11:15, the diary recorded a violation, described in the same shorthand Berdella had used with Howell. 10 minutes later, a new entry appeared. D.C. In the cramped third-floor room, Berdella dipped a cotton swab into household drain cleaner, a caustic mixture, the kind used to burn through clogs, and pressed it directly into Sheldon's left eye. The effect was immediate. Sheldon's pupils shrank to pinpoints. A muted, muffled scream shook through him for 1 or 2 minutes before fading into the sedation. Sheldon begged inconsistently, weak phrases, fragmented pleas that rose and fell as the drugs overtook him. None of it slowed what came next. Berdella documented a soap and water enema, followed by another assault using a household vegetable, recorded with the same shorthand as Howell's torture logs. The objects, the chemicals, the restraints, all of them were methods of domination, not gratification. Even Berdella later admitted the purpose was to assert control, to earn back perceived debts in the most punishing way possible. By 2:45 a.m., Sheldon lay tied to the bed, heavily anesthetized. Berdella left him there and returned at 6:10 a.m., checking the ropes and delivering more injections. He assaulted him again. Below that entry came 2 words: plugged ears. Berdella had used a caulking gun to fill both of Sheldon's ear canals with sealant, reducing his ability to hear, trapping him further inside the chemical haze that kept him compliant. Morning brought new cruelty. Berdella took out hypodermic needles and pushed them beneath Sheldon's fingernails and into the sensitive flesh of his fingertips. He referred to it as acupuncture, testing which areas produced a reaction, if any. Sheldon likely couldn't respond. The sedation was too deep, his voice smothered by chemicals and fear. With Sheldon bound in the third-floor bedroom, Berdella went to work at the shop as if nothing waited for him at home. He admitted later that his only concern was the fear that Sheldon might regain enough strength to escape. Not for Sheldon's safety, but because it could expose everything. That fear, he said, brought with it a kind of perverse thrill. When Berdella returned that afternoon, Sheldon attempted to resist again. Faint, slurred protests, "You have to let me go. You can't do this," rose from the bed. Berdella answered by striking him in the back of the head with a rubber mallet. The injections continued. One syringe contained only sugar water, which Berdella believed might provide nutrient value to keep Sheldon alive longer. Later that night at 3 a.m., the notes shifted to a new abbreviation, EK. This marked the first time Berdella used electrical torture. He anchored wires to Sheldon's skin by inserting 2 hypodermic needles into his body, one in the shoulder, one in the back, and then clipped the cables from the transformer onto the exposed needles. When he switched the device on, current surged directly into muscle and nerve. Berdella shocked him for several seconds at a time, adjusting placement, testing the response. He stopped after only a few minutes and went to sleep. When morning came, he assaulted Sheldon again, then left for the flea market between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. After work, he returned to the room and continued. He bound Sheldon's wrists with piano wire, tightening it enough to damage the nerves so that if he ever untied him, Sheldon's hands would be useless. On Monday, April 15th, Berdella left for a trade show downtown. When he returned, he saw Philip Bukovich working on the roof outside, just as they had arranged weeks prior. The sight of another man on the property forced his decision. Sheldon, still bound in the third-floor bedroom, was a risk. Berdella climbed the stairs, retrieved a roll of plastic trash bags and pulled one free. He slipped the bag over Sheldon's head and cinched it tightly around the neck with a rope or sash. Sheldon, unable to see, breathe, or fight, suffocated where he lay. Berdella stayed in the room long enough to take one photograph of Sheldon's final moments. Then he left the body on the floor and tended to other tasks on the third floor, returning only once he was certain Sheldon was dead. Berdella wasted no time. He dragged the body to the bathroom on the same level, a cramped space with old tile and a stained porcelain tub, and lifted Sheldon inside. From there, everything unfolded with the same clinical detachment used throughout the captivity. He took out a razor blade and opened the skin around the major joints, small, strategic cuts meant to release the remaining blood. It pooled beneath the body and drifted down the drain in slow, diluted spirals. Berdella waited 4 or 5 hours, letting gravity and time finish what the blade had started. When the body drained to his satisfaction, he returned with a boning knife, additional razor blades, and a bow saw. The first night, he removed the arms and legs, working with a deliberate slowness that suggested familiarity rather than panic. He left the remaining torso and head in the tub overnight, the tile floor cold, the house silent, the body waiting for the next step. The following evening, he completed the dismemberment. Each section was wrapped carefully, sealed to prevent leakage, and carried down to the basement, where the cool air would delay decomposition and limit the odor that might seep into the rest of the house. He had learned from Howell's disposal that concealment required timing and temperature. But Sheldon's head received different treatment. Rather than sealing it with the rest, Berdella placed the head into a trash bag, set it in an upright freezer on the back porch, and left it there for several days. When he finally retrieved it, he carried it into the backyard under cover of night. Before burying it, he removed the skin and hair, reducing the likelihood anyone would identify it should the ground ever give way. He then hid it beneath the soil, returning inside as if completing an ordinary household chore. The rest of Sheldon's remains stayed in the basement until the following Monday. Once again, Berdella brought the bags to the curb just before the garbage truck's arrival. And just like Howell, Sheldon disappeared into the city's refuse system without a trace, lifted, compacted, and carried to a landfill where nothing could be recovered. Investigators later reviewed 19 photographs associated with Sheldon. They were unlike anything they had seen before. One captured the moment electricity, 7,700 volts from the transformer, stiffened Sheldon's entire body. Others documented the chemical injections, the restraints, and the staged assaults. Each image matched the entries from Berdella's notes with chilling precision. Even hardened detectives struggled to remain expressionless. The photographs showed not chaos but order, not frenzy but structure. Everything about the scene suggested a man who had mapped out the night long before it began. And Sheldon, like Howell, vanished from Kansas City without anyone knowing where he had gone. In June, Berdella encountered Mark Wallace, a casual acquaintance who had helped with yard work, seeking shelter from a violent storm in his tool shed. He brought Wallace inside and quickly recognized how tense, withdrawn, and unstable he appeared. Exploiting that vulnerability, Berdella offered him an injection of chlorpromazine under the pretense that it would help him calm down. Wallace agreed, unaware that within the next half hour, Berdella had already decided to keep him from leaving. Wallace was taken upstairs, where his condition deteriorated under a series of escalating abuse meant to keep him conscious and compliant. Berdella later admitted to using electrical stimulation and repeated needle insertions across Wallace's back in what he described as experimentation. Less than a day after the ordeal began, Wallace stopped breathing. Berdella recorded the death as occurring at 7 p.m. on June 23rd, attributing it to a combination of drugs, restraint, and oxygen deprivation. Walter James Ferris entered Berdella's life through Gene Shaw, another Westport regular, who drifted through the flea market booths. Ferris and Shaw bought chlorpromazine from Berdella at one point, later trading it back to him for marijuana. The exchanges were casual until early 1985, when Independence police questioned Berdella about a drug sale. He immediately suspected Ferris and Shaw had set him up. From that moment forward, resentment simmered. He didn't see either man again until September 1985, months after Howell, Sheldon, and Wallace were already dead. On September 24th, Berdella picked Ferris up hitchhiking. That brief encounter set off 2 days of interactions, late-night calls, drop-ins, and the pair rummaging through Berdella's belongings while stoned, that scraped at Berdella's nerves. By September 26th, the irritation had turned into something sharper. Ferris and Shaw had broken into the house the night before, wandering the rooms until sunrise. Later that day, Ferris called, asking Berdella to meet him at the Midnight Sun, a gay bar in Midtown Kansas City. Berdella was exhausted, still entangled in his ongoing attempts to track down Kellogg and Simmons over money disputes, but he agreed to meet Ferris anyway. His log would later mark the moment simply, 7:30 bar, Ferris. Ferris asked if he could stay at the Charlotte Street house again. Before going over, he wanted to stop at his own home to collect some clothing and personal items. The intent to capture Ferris had already hardened by then. The combination of property damage, drug-steeped behavior, unannounced visits, and suspected betrayal had pushed Berdella into the same mindset that led to his previous victims. Ferris was unreliable, intrusive, and, most importantly, unconnected enough that his disappearance would draw little immediate attention. They left the bar, retrieved Ferris's belongings, and drove to the Charlotte Street house, arriving around 8:30 p.m. Berdella prepared a simple dinner, microwaved burritos and chili. But the chili Ferris received had been altered. While heating the food, Berdella crushed multiple tranquilizer and sedative tablets into a fine powder and stirred them into the serving. Ferris had also asked for 2 Valiums, which Berdella supplied. The combined effects hit quickly. Ferris carried the plate upstairs to the second-floor bedroom and ate on the bed. Within minutes of finishing, he lost consciousness. By 9 p.m., he was snoring heavily. Berdella removed Ferris's clothing, then tested him with a needle to see whether the body registered pain or movement. Ferris didn't twitch. There was no reflex, no attempt to wake, nothing to indicate he was capable of resisting. The cycle he had perfected with earlier victims, injections, photographs, and domination carried out on an body, began again, and the night folded into the same pattern of sedation and exploitation that marked the others. Once Ferris was unconscious, Berdella moved methodically, as though settling into a routine he no longer had to think about. The restraints came first. Wrists secured, ankles bound, gag fastened in place. Even sedated, Ferris gave small instinctive movements, a twitch of the legs, a strained breath, faint attempts to pull away. They didn't stop anything. Through those early hours, Berdella subjected him to escalating violations, using whatever objects were closest at hand. It was mechanical, detached, and performed with the precision of someone rehearsing a sequence rather than improvising one. By midnight, Ferris's resistance, small, weak, but present, angered him. Berdella retrieved the transformer again, this time improvising new electrodes from metal spatulas from his own kitchen. When the current surged, Ferris jerked and mumbled broken fragments of protest. His sentences fell apart in the space between breaths, fevered and incoherent. But the intent was unmistakable. Fear, confusion, disbelief. Berdella shifted the charged metal across Ferris's body, touching down on his shoulders, buttocks, and groin, moving the arcs of pain without ever turning off the current. It let him work faster, unhindered by reconnecting wire leads. The shocks lasted only a few minutes per session, but they were enough to break Ferris's already eroding senses. The transformation from man to captive was nearly complete. As the night tightened, Berdella threaded hypodermic needles into the most sensitive regions of Ferris's body, his warped version of acupuncture, testing which nerves still reacted beneath the chemical fog. Ferris stirred occasionally, prompting Berdella to redose him with tranquilizers. Moments later he would slump again, defeated by the drugs. By 5 a.m., Berdella noted that Ferris began to move more freely, so he struck him with short bursts of electricity and kept injecting him. Dawn rose while Ferris remained sprawled on the bed, gagged, bound, and sinking deeper into drug-induced delirium. The torment didn't stop until Berdella left for work at 10:45 a.m., leaving Ferris tied and fading in the upstairs room. When Berdella returned later that day, he resumed as if picking up an interrupted project. At 4:45 p.m., he suddenly decided to take his temperature, recording it as 99 degrees. This tiny spike became another excuse to experiment. He injected Ferris with penicillin, as though he were treating a patient rather than dismantling one. Then he checked Ferris's pupils, documenting their responses like a student in a laboratory. By evening, Ferris was barely conscious at all, slipping in and out of awareness, struggling to lift himself for even seconds at a time. Berdella's notes show the assaults continued late into the night, with Ferris giving only faint, disjointed objections. At 11:15 p.m., then again at 11:30, Berdella recorded more assaults. Ferris's voice, once furious and confused, had shrunk to fractured sounds. Berdella wrote the grim line beside them. Unable to sit up more than 10-15 seconds. By midnight, there was nothing left to fight. Berdella checked on him again and found his captive lifeless. No movement, no breathing, no pupil response. In his logbook, he marked the moment with a single number. 86, the restaurant shorthand meant finished, discarded, ended. Ferris had died late in the night on September 27, 1985, after nearly 2 full days of chemical sedation, restraints, electrical shocks, physical trauma, and forced compliance. Berdella untied the body, dragged it to the third-floor bathroom, and followed the same ritual he had already perfected. Razor cuts to drain the blood, a long wait for gravity to do its work. Then the dismemberment, efficient and practiced, made easier, he later remarked, because Ferris was physically slighter than the others. No part of Ferris was kept. Everything, remains, clothing, bindings, was sealed in trash bags and carried to the curb before dawn, exactly timed for pickup. Just another load of Kansas City garbage, swallowed by a landfill before the sun was fully up. Todd Allen Stoops was 23 when he crossed paths with Berdella for the last time. He had known Berdella before, staying twice in the house with his wife during unstable stretches in 1984. But after drifting out of that temporary refuge, their lives diverged. It wasn't until June 17, 1986, at Liberty Memorial Park, that their paths converged again. Stoops was thin, restless, and desperate for drug money. When he mentioned needing $13, Berdella used the moment, offering lunch, shelter, and the promise of sex in exchange. Stoops followed him home, unaware he would never leave. What set this captivity apart was desire. Berdella openly admitted later that he found Stoops physically compelling and that attraction fed something far more dangerous. The restraint, the schedule, the chemical control. Everything escalated because he wanted Stoops compliant, weakened, and fully dependent. What started as sedation became a 2-week descent, engineered by someone who blended lust, domination, and cruelty into one seamless routine. The early days were punctuated by calculated steps designed to take away Stoops's strength. The drugs were measured to keep him docile. The restraints tightened. The mood of the house shifted from opportunity to ownership, and Berdella began testing thresholds. How much pain, how much fear, how much obedience he could extract before Stoops broke. He gradually increased Stoops' terror, attempting to make him a cooperative and incapacitated Before long, the violence intensified. Berdella used electrical shocks directly against Stoops' closed eyes, aiming to blind him and remove one more means of resistance. To silence him, he forced drain cleaner into his larynx, burning the tissue and strangling the voice he didn't want to hear. Each new method wasn't spontaneous. It was a steady climb toward total control. By the second week, Stoops was exhausted, shaking and begging for basic needs. One afternoon, he asked for a sandwich and a drink, nothing more than the smallest mercy. When Berdella refused, Stoops collapsed into tears. His body was failing, and every day his ability to fight back slipped further away. The injuries added up. On June 27th, the assault reached a catastrophic point. The internal damage to Stoops' wall ruptured, creating an infection that his weakened body had no way to fight. Discharge, fever, and sepsis followed. He grew pale and incoherent. By the final day, Stoops couldn't even sit upright without choking on his own breath. His lungs strained for air he could no longer pull in. On July 1st, 1986, 2 weeks after he walked through Berdella's door, Stoops died in the upstairs bedroom. A forensic pathologist later confirmed that the torn internal wall triggered septic shock, and his body simply shut down under the weight of infection and trauma. Berdella treated the remains no differently than the others. He waited, then carried the body to the bathroom, methodically dismembered it, and sealed the parts inside trash bags. By morning, Todd Stoops, his life, his suffering, everything, was gone, buried somewhere beneath Kansas City refuse. Larry Wayne Pearson was 20 years old when he wandered into Berdella's Westport shop in the spring of 1987. What began as a harmless conversation, Pearson reminiscing about childhood fascinations with witchcraft and magic, turned into a friendly acquaintance. He drifted into Berdella's house not long after, helping with chores to cover rent, moving through the rooms as casually as dozens of troubled young men had before him. Nothing at first suggested he was destined for the basement. Berdella later claimed he had no plan to capture Pearson during those early days. But on June 23rd, just 2 weeks after bailing Pearson out of jail and watching him show no intention of finding steady work, something in Berdella shifted. The two spent that afternoon watching Creepshow 2, eating lunch and driving aimlessly through Kansas City. Pearson made a joke, offhand, careless, about robbing gay men back in Wichita. That was the moment Berdella made his decision. Whatever friendship existed evaporated. A new purpose took shape. That evening he made sure Pearson drank enough to dull his awareness. Once he was suitably drunk, Berdella injected chlorpromazine and maneuvered him down into the basement. There, he tied Pearson's hands over his head and secured the rope to a brick support column. He then forced drain cleaner directly into Pearson's larynx, burning the throat meant for screaming. An electrical transformer soon followed, wires and clips ready. Pearson was unlike the others. Compliance came quickly, not from trust but from understanding the consequences. On the 5th day, after enduring repeated electrical shocks and the deliberate breaking of bones in his hands with an iron bar, he stopped resisting entirely. Berdella took this as cooperation, as permission to escalate in a more controlled way. As a reward, he moved Pearson out of the basement and into a second-floor room. He warned that obedience would spare him some of the pain he'd already experienced. For the rest of his 6-week captivity, Pearson adapted in ways that made Berdella believe he had mastered him. He learned to sleep without shifting, afraid that even an unconscious movement might provoke another beating or a return to the basement. His silence, his stillness, his forced submission, these became his only defenses. But after 6 weeks of living inside that tightening cage, something in Pearson finally broke. During another assault, he clamped down with his teeth, biting deeply into Berdella's, then screamed that he could not endure another moment. The sudden explosion of defiance shattered whatever illusion of control Berdella thought he had. The response was immediate and lethal. Berdella seized a thick tree limb and beat Pearson until he lay unconscious, then slipped a plastic bag over his head and tightened a ligature around the neck until the body stopped moving. Only after Pearson was dead did Berdella drive himself to a hospital for treatment of the bite wound. Pearson's body met the same fate as the others. Berdella carried the remains to the basement, cut them apart with practiced efficiency, and sealed the pieces into plastic. The head was wrapped and stored in the freezer for a time before he buried it in the backyard, finishing the cycle he had repeated victim after victim. Larry Pearson had lasted 6 weeks, longer than any of the others, but in the end, the house on Charlotte Street consumed him all the same. In the early hours of March 29, 1988, just past 1 in the morning, Robert Berdella brought a 22-year-old male prostitute named Christopher Bryson into the house on Charlotte Street under the pretense of paid sex. The moment the door closed, the offer vanished. Berdella smashed an iron bar against Bryson's head, dropping him instantly, then secured him to the upstairs bed with the same practiced precision he had used on the others. What followed mirrored the pattern of the previous victims: drugs, restraints, and calculated cruelty. This time, Berdella burned Bryson's eyes with ammonia, wiping it across his eyelids as he warned, "The only things you need to think about are you, me, and this house." For days, Bryson endured the regimen: assaults, forced immobilization, injections to the throat intended to destroy his voice. Eventually, Berdella shifted tactics, telling Bryson he was beginning to trust him. He claimed he would discuss certain parts of the abuse, but that his self-control was not negotiable, ending the conversation with a chilling reminder: "I've brought others this far. They're dead because they made mistakes." By the 3rd day, Bryson began manipulating the only leverage he had: persuasion. He convinced Berdella to tie his arms in front of him rather than above his head, claiming his hands were going numb. He also talked Berdella into leaving a television on whenever he stepped out, the remote tucked between Bryson's legs. Beneath that stillness, Bryson thought of nothing but escape. The next afternoon, fortune tilted his way. Berdella carelessly left behind a book of matches. The moment he left for work, Bryson twisted his wrists toward the flame and slowly burned through the rope. Barefoot and wearing only a dog collar, he forced open a second-floor window and hurled himself into the yard below, breaking a bone in his foot as he hit the ground. He limped toward a utility worker walking along the street and begged him to call police. The man hurried him to a nearby house, where the residents phoned authorities. When officers arrived, they found Bryson shaking, injured, and barely able to see through swollen, chemically burned eyes. To the 4 officers at the scene, Bryson explained he had been picked up while hitchhiking, dragged to the house and held for 4 days. He described being bound to the bed, repeatedly drugged, and injected with drain cleaner to keep him from screaming. His body bore the evidence: welts across his torso, cuts, bruises, and the raw marks of restraints. 2 officers were assigned to secretly watch the property, while another rushed Bryson to Menorah Medical Center. The 4th radioed headquarters, requesting a formal search warrant for the house on Charlotte Street, the place where so many had vanished and where one victim had finally broken the pattern. The afternoon Christopher Bryson escaped, police placed Berdella under arrest for sexual assault. He refused to let officers inside the house, but the warrant that detectives had already requested arrived within hours, and the door at 315 Charlotte Street was opened, legally and for the last time. Inside the second-floor bedroom, investigators found the proof Bryson had described: burned rope still tied to the footboard, an electrical transformer plugged into the wall with leads stretched toward the bed, and a metal tray holding syringes, prescription bottles, cotton swabs, and eye drop vials. A long iron pipe lay nearby, along with coils of rope and leather belts. The posts of the bed were rubbed raw from earlier struggles. As officers spread through the house, the darkness of the property deepened. A human skull was found tucked inside a closet upstairs. In the backyard, they uncovered a partially decomposed head. Down a hallway, investigators opened envelopes containing loose human teeth, and on a shelf nearby lay vertebrae marked with cuts from blades, evidence of both knife work and hacksawing. In the basement, a hacksaw and miter saw waited beside a chainsaw smeared with blood, tissue, and pubic hair. Luminol illuminated the concrete floor and plastic trash barrels in sheets of glowing blue, large stains of long-cleaned blood. Polaroids were everywhere. 334 instant photos and 34 snapshot prints documented men alive, drugged, restrained, dying, or already dead. Some were clearly Bryson. Others were masked in angles, but unmistakably suffering. Beside them lay chains, cuffs, improvised devices, narcotics paraphernalia, hypodermic needles, pornographic magazines, and a book on drug chemistry. On top of a dresser sat a stenographer's pad filled with detailed torture logs, each victim's torment itemized in Berdella's writing. In another closet, detectives found newspaper clippings about Jerry Howell's disappearance and a wallet and driver's license belonging to James Ferris, both long missing. Before the search ended, KCPD assembled a special task force, 11 detectives and a sergeant, to focus exclusively on the widening horror. As they charted Berdella's history, they learned he had long been known among hustlers and runaways as someone to avoid. Rumors of drugging, injecting, and violent sex had circulated for years, along with whispers that he was connected to the disappearances of Howell and Ferris. Missing person files confirmed both suspicions. Berdella had been interviewed during each disappearance but shut down questioning, demanding an attorney and threatening to accuse police of harassment through his lawyer. The Polaroids forced the truth out. Ferris's wife identified her husband in several of the photos, some taken after his death. Paul Howell identified a picture of a young man hanging upside down in Berdella's basement as his son. Other images showed men the task force could not immediately name, prompting detectives to begin identifying each figure and determining whether they were alive. Because several pictures included parts of the photographer's own body, a judge issued an order on April 13th requiring Berdella to pose nude so angles and body shapes could be compared to the original photos. Dozens of male names had been scrawled across notepads in the house, and detectives followed each lead. One name, Freddie Kellogg, gave the investigation its first living window into Berdella's private world. Kellogg disclosed that he and several other young men had stayed with Berdella over the years. Drugs were freely administered, often intravenously, and sex was expected whether they consented or not. Kellogg admitted he was asked to lure other young men to Berdella's house for parties, so Berdella could drug them. If anyone was suspected of informing for police, Berdella used that threat to control them. Kellogg identified 3 of the men in the Polaroids: Todd Stoops, Robert Sheldon, and Larry Pearson. Detectives quickly confirmed that Pearson had been bonded out of jail by Berdella for $30 in June 1987, and that no further trace of him existed except for a hospital report where Berdella, under the name Larry Pearson, claimed a man had bitten his penis during oral sex. Employers of Robert Sheldon confirmed he vanished in April 1985, leaving behind years of reliable attendance with no explanation. After the search ended, Berdella was officially informed of the discoveries. That same afternoon, he was again ordered to pose nude for evidence comparison. During his first formal attempt at interrogation, he invoked his right to silence and refused every question. When investigators later sought handwriting samples to match the torture notes, he again refused, earning a 6-month contempt of court sentence. The facade was finished. The photographs, the bones, the tools, the logs, the stains in the basement, every piece told a story he could no longer outrun. Once confronted with the evidence taken from his home, Berdella abandoned denial and coolly walked investigators through every abduction, assault, and killing, using his torture logs as reference. His confession was clinical and emotionless, confirming 6 murders and the methods behind each one. On July 22, 1988, he was indicted for killing Larry Pearson. A month later, he abruptly pleaded guilty, admitting under oath that he suffocated Pearson with a plastic bag. Judge Alvin Randall sentenced him to life without parole. He soon entered another guilty plea for the son of Christopher Bryson, adding a second life sentence and 7 more years. To avoid the death penalty on the remaining cases, Berdella agreed to describe all 6 murders in full detail. On December 19, 1988, he pleaded guilty to killing Robert Sheldon and 4 others, receiving 5 additional life sentences, sealing his fate. In prison, he tried to recast himself as misunderstood, blaming the media and complaining about his health. On October 8, 1992, he collapsed from heart pain and died in a Columbia hospital at 3:55 p.m. Judge Randall, notified shortly after, remarked, "Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy." Psychological evaluations later confirmed what his crimes had already shown. He was a sexual sadist who never expressed remorse, referring to his victims only as play toys.